Some comets drift quietly through the void, tails trailing behind like threads of memory. Others flare violently as sunlight awakens ancient ice. But 3, I-Atlas did something that no comet, natural or otherwise, should ever do. It pointed its tail the wrong way. Not away from the sun, but toward it, and then, as if realizing its mistake, it reversed direction, calmly, deliberately, like a spacecraft correcting its course. Before you scroll away and write this off as clickbait science fiction, stay with me, because the latest telescope images confirm that this reversal happened, and that what we're watching may be unlike anything the solar system has ever seen. Let's break down what we know, and what we don't. The story begins in July of 2025, when astronomers tracking a faint interstellar visitor noticed something odd. Its coma, the glowing envelope of gas around its nucleus, burned brighter on the side facing the sun, but in the wrong direction. Instead of shedding material away from the light, 3I-Atlas was venting toward it. At first, no one believed it. The data had to be wrong. Comets don't fight the sun, they flee from it. But repeated measurements confirmed the impossible. The jet persisted, pushing against the direction of radiation pressure. By August, telescopes across the world were focused on the same object, all recording the same defiant behavior. Under ordinary circumstances, solar wind and heat work together to shape a comet's tail. The sun's energy vaporizes ice on the surface, and the wind drives that vapor outward, away from the star. It's one of the simplest, most reliable relationships in space. Yet here was an object breaking it. Scientists proposed every natural cause they could imagine: rotation, uneven heating, hidden fractures beneath the surface. But none of it explained why the jet stayed perfectly stable instead of flickering as the comet spun. And then, almost like the final act of a play, the comet reversed. Over several weeks, the tail slowly pivoted back until it pointed away from the sun once again, behaving exactly as it should have from the start. For astronomers, the reversal wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. Comets can brighten, split, or erupt, but a complete flip in jet direction had never been recorded so cleanly. It seemed to happen gradually, as though something inside 3I-Atlas was adjusting itself. A natural object shouldn't have that kind of coordination. The data forced everyone to take a step back and ask the question no one wanted to ask: what could cause such precision? Some scientists argued that the comet's spin might have shifted unexpectedly, that tidal forces or internal venting altered its axis and exposed a new surface region to the sun. Others pointed out that if this were true, the pattern of brightness would have oscillated as it rotated. It didn't. Instead, the light curve remained smooth and deliberate, following a single transition without chaos or randomness. The explanation didn't fit rotation or geometry or coincidence. Something else was happening. The comet's jet acts like a micro-thruster, tiny bursts of momentum that can nudge its orbit over time. When gas vents toward the sun, the recoil pushes the comet backward, slowing it down. When gas escapes in the opposite direction, the object accelerates. The change is measurable. Even small comets leave signatures of these forces in their orbital paths. Yet 3I-Atlas didn't. Its trajectory followed Newton's predictions with near-perfect accuracy, showing no detectable acceleration at all. That left only two explanations. Either the jets were perfectly balanced, somehow firing in a way that cancelled out every bit of thrust, or the comet was so massive that the expelled material had almost no effect. Both ideas were hard to accept. Perfect symmetry in nature is almost unheard of, and a mass large enough to resist that much force would make Atlas far denser than any known comet. It was like finding a balloon that refused to move no matter how hard the wind pushed. The deeper scientists looked, the stranger the numbers became. Estimates placed its mass somewhere between 30 and 50 billion tons, but that didn't make sense with its observed brightness. The only way for those numbers to work was if the object were unusually compact, perhaps not a loose cluster of rock and ice, but a cohesive, hardened body. Some even speculated it might contain metallic content, though no spectra confirmed that. Every dataset raised more questions. The composition shifted from carbon-rich to water-heavy gases as the jet changed direction. The structure of the tail evolved slowly but precisely, and the timing of the reversal aligned perfectly with its closest approach to the sun. Nothing about it looked random. It looked deliberate. By late September, observatories around the world had turned their attention to the visitor. Night after night, data poured in. Spectra, brightness curves, dust measurements, and each new result only deepened the mystery. The comet seemed to be following a plan. Its outgassing rate rose and fell in smooth waves, synchronized with its motion toward the sun. There were no sudden eruptions, no irregular flickers, none of the chaos that usually defines these frozen travelers. It was almost too clean. Teams in Chile and Spain compared their results and confirmed that the change in jet orientation was not a trick of viewing geometry. Earth's position, the sun's angle, even atmospheric distortion were accounted for. The tail had truly reversed, not because of illusion, but because something physical inside the object had flipped. The idea spread quickly across research channels and private forums. Some called it an internal realignment event. Others labeled it a spontaneous inversion. Theories multiplied, each less convincing than the last. Could subsurface gas pockets have opened on the opposite side? Could heat from the sun have triggered explosive venting through new fractures? The numbers didn't agree. The reversal wasn't explosive. It was controlled, unfolding over weeks. If pressure buildup had caused it, astronomers would have seen a flare in brightness. There was none. Instead, the energy output remained steady, as if regulated. Those who studied comets for decades began to admit the truth that no one wanted to say aloud. 3I Atlas wasn't behaving like a natural object. Meanwhile, the public fascination grew into obsession. Social media filled with side-by-side comparisons, timelines, and amateur theories. Some posts described it as a cosmic engine. Others called it a message. Even mainstream outlets began to echo the tone of disbelief. For the first time in years, the scientific community found itself sharing the spotlight with conspiracy theorists and struggling to answer the same question. What was this thing, really? In private, even veteran astronomers confessed they didn't know. A few started to whisper about something more deliberate. The engineered probe hypothesis, once dismissed as pseudoscience, returned to the conversation. If 3I Atlas had been built, if it was a probe launched long ago from another star, its strange behavior would make sense. A braking burn aimed toward the sun to slow its approach, followed by a thrust in the opposite direction to accelerate out of the system again. To most scientists, that idea sounded absurd, but so did the data. Nature wasn't supposed to be this precise. Behind closed doors, research teams began running silent simulations. They adjusted every variable they could imagine: rotation periods, internal composition, gas temperature, surface roughness. But the results all ended the same way. The only models that could reproduce what telescopes observed required a pattern of constant correction. Not random venting, not chaotic eruptions, but a sequence of small, timed thrusts that maintained a consistent orientation. It looked like guidance. The notion unsettled even the most pragmatic scientists. Comets don't guide themselves. They don't stabilize, they don't execute reversals, and they certainly don't hold steady vectors for weeks on end. Yet the math refused to cooperate with disbelief. Something about the jet's rhythm was too consistent to ignore. Its change in direction didn't match any known precession or spin pattern. If 3I Atlas was tumbling, the jets should have flickered with each rotation. Instead, they stayed locked, unwavering, as if following a silent metronome. Some researchers tried to salvage the natural explanation by invoking compositional layering. Perhaps, they argued, the outer crust contained ices that sublimated at low temperatures, and once those were gone, deeper material with different properties began to vent from another part of the surface. That could, in theory, shift the main jet's position. But that logic broke down under scrutiny. The reversal wasn't partial. It was complete. A 180-degree flip. The jet that once faced the sun now streamed perfectly in the opposite direction, almost as though a deliberate maneuver had been executed. To anyone studying the timeline, the moment of inversion aligned too precisely with the comet's approach to perihelion, its closest point to the sun. The symmetry was eerie, the kind that nature rarely gifts without a reason. By the end of October, the comet had become a riddle wrapped in mathematics. Its path remained exactly where gravitational models predicted it should be. No measurable thrust, no detectable acceleration, just flawless adherence to Newton's equations. Yet the imagery contradicted that perfection, showing behavior that should have produced motion but didn't. A paradox suspended in black space. Scientists began to publish cautiously worded papers, hedging their language with phrases like anomalous jet orientation and non-periodic emission transition. But between the lines, the tone was unmistakable. Confusion, curiosity, and a quiet hint of awe. What they were seeing didn't fit their understanding of comets, or even physics as they knew it. Whatever 3I Atlas was doing, it seemed aware of the laws that bound it, and chose to bend them gently, as if testing the limits of what we thought was possible. The days leading up to its closest approach were filled with tension. Every observatory capable of tracking it prepared for continuous monitoring. For some astronomers, it was just another opportunity to collect data. For others, it felt like waiting for an answer to a question older than science itself. As the comet drew nearer to the sun, its glow intensified. The coma expanded. The color shifted subtly from blue-white to green, a sign that different gases were now dominating the mix. But even as its chemistry evolved, the geometry of the jets stayed unnervingly precise. Instruments on Earth and in orbit detected no random bursts, no new cracks opening on the surface. It was as though the entire body had entered a controlled state. In normal comets, solar heating turns their surfaces into chaos. Craters collapse, vents erupt, ice boils away, and clouds of dust spiral out into space. But 3I Atlas remained calm. Observers began calling it the silent comet. It moved through its own transformation without noise or turmoil, maintaining a kind of cosmic poise. That serenity made some wonder whether its behavior was truly unprecedented, or whether something else in the universe had exhibited patterns like this before. Old records were revisited, including those of Oumuamua, the first known interstellar visitor, which had also shown faint, unexplained accelerations. Some scientists had once suggested that Oumuamua could be an artificial object, a remnant of an alien probe. Now, years later, the idea didn't seem so outlandish. 3I Atlas shared too many similarities: its interstellar origin, its strange stability, and now, its refusal to obey the usual rules. What made this even more puzzling was the lack of measurable reaction. If Atlas was venting material with enough force to create visible jets, its orbit should have shifted, even slightly. But its path through the solar system remained gravitationally perfect. No deviations, no sign of recoil. The laws of motion seemed to apply selectively, as if the forces at work were balancing themselves out. That balance was perhaps the most unnatural feature of all. Perfect symmetry rarely happens in nature. It's something found in design, in engineering, in the deliberate shaping of structure and function. To see it out in space, playing out over millions of kilometers, made even the most skeptical scientists uneasy. The closer Atlas moved to the Sun, the more questions it seemed to pose. Theories multiplied, but none fit completely. It vented, but didn't move. It heated, but didn't fracture. It followed physics, but behaved like it knew them too well. The night before its perihelion, telescopes on every continent stood ready. Astronomers expected either brilliance or collapse. Whatever was about to happen would decide whether 3I Atlas was a strange comet or something else entirely. When dawn broke on October 29th, 2025, the world held its breath. This was the day of perihelion, the moment when 3I Atlas would pass closest to the Sun. It had taken months of observation to reach this point, and now every telescope, every radio dish, every spectrometer was focused on a single object. For most comets, this is the breaking point. The heat becomes unbearable. Ice turns to gas in violent bursts, fragments spin off, and the nucleus disintegrates. But Atlas defied the script. As it approached the blinding glare, its brightness surged, then steadied. It didn't fracture or explode. It endured. Some scientists described it as serene, others as unsettlingly composed. The coma grew larger, wrapping the object in a perfectly symmetrical envelope of light. Within that envelope, faint structures rippled, patterns of emission that looked less like chaos and more like choreography. Spectral analysis showed rapid chemical transitions as frozen layers boiled away, yet the jet's orientation remained locked in place, fixed like a compass needle. Whatever controlled the venting seemed immune to the stress of proximity. When the comet crossed its closest point to the Sun, an unexpected thing happened. For a brief window of time, just a few hours, the jet output increased sharply, not in random bursts, but in a pulse, a single rhythmic sequence, almost mechanical. 3 flares in perfect succession, then silence. Each flare released massive amounts of gas, but the total energy was still too small to alter the trajectory. The pattern was clear though: 3 measured exhalations, evenly spaced, before the output returned to its normal, steady flow. Some dismissed it as coincidence, but others were less sure. One astrophysicist described it later as the cosmic equivalent of a heartbeat. Across observatories, scientists reviewed the timing again and again. The symmetry was too exact to be noise. Even so, there was no evidence of propulsion, no measurable push, nothing that indicated an engine. Whatever had caused the pulse, it left no trace except data and unease. Then came the most shocking detail of all. When 3I Atlas emerged from the Sun's glare, its tail had reoriented yet again. Not dramatically, but subtly, angled now at a slant, neither toward nor away from the sun. It was as if the comet had adjusted course, not by force, but by intention. The change was small, just a few degrees, but unmistakable. After that, the object resumed its calm descent back into the outer solar system, the faintest whisper of light fading into the black. For days afterward, the data was studied obsessively. Every spectrum, every timing interval, every fluctuation was examined in search of a clue. Nothing like this had ever been seen before. The comet that refused to obey nature had also refused to destroy itself. It had survived the sun. That alone made it extraordinary. Normally, objects passing that close either fragment or vaporize. But 3I Atlas seemed almost unchanged. When it emerged from the solar glare, its coma was stable, its brightness nearly identical to before perihelion. Even its rotational light curve, measured by minute changes in reflected sunlight, was smooth, unbroken, and strangely uniform. The object appeared to have passed through one of the most dangerous regions in space without suffering any visible damage. That wasn't just odd, it was impossible. A new wave of theories spread through the community. Some insisted that the comet's materials must have been unusually resilient, perhaps containing refractory compounds capable of withstanding extreme heat. Others speculated about electromagnetic shielding effects caused by interactions between the solar wind and an unknown magnetic field around the object. None of those explanations held up for long. The temperatures it endured were enough to melt most metals. Whatever protected it wasn't something known to science. When researchers tried to simulate the conditions it had faced, their models failed. Even the most optimistic assumptions predicted catastrophic loss of material. And yet, the real object was intact. As it moved farther from the sun, its behavior only grew stranger. The 3 pulses detected during perihelion seemed to repeat faintly in later data. A subtle rhythm, spaced evenly in time, too consistent to ignore. Every 8 days, small increases in gas output appeared. Measured, regular, deliberate. Each spike was followed by perfect calm, as though the object were maintaining a schedule. Astronomers tried to find natural cycles that could explain it: rotation, thermal lag, pressure oscillations. None fit. The periodicity was too clean. It was the kind of timing that suggested regulation, like the ticking of an unseen mechanism. Meanwhile, the public fascination reached a fever pitch. News outlets began referring to it as the breathing comet. Live streams of its tracking data drew millions of viewers. Scientists, usually skeptical of poetic names, quietly adopted it too. The breathing comet, an object that seemed alive. For many, it became more than a scientific anomaly. It became a question. If an interstellar object could behave this way, what did that mean for the others that might pass unnoticed through the dark? If this one was natural, it forced us to admit that the universe is capable of more complexity than we've dared imagine. And if it wasn't, if it truly was engineered, then we weren't just watching a comet. We were watching intent move through space. As the weeks passed, 3I Atlas receded from the inner solar system, drifting steadily toward the cold and quiet beyond Mars. It should have faded quickly, like most comets do, once they leave the sun's warmth. But this one refused to dim. Its coma remained bright, its tail structured, as though it still carried an internal energy source, feeding the slow release of gas. That steady persistence made some researchers uneasy. Comets are transient things, brief flares in the dark. They ignite, dazzle, then disappear. Atlas was lingering, holding itself together as if it had more to accomplish. New instruments were brought online, including deep space radar arrays, normally reserved for near-Earth asteroid tracking. They returned faint reflections, barely enough to form an image, but what they suggested was startling. The nucleus appeared smoother than expected. Most comets are rough, irregular, shaped like shattered rubble. Atlas looked compact, aerodynamic, almost polished. That single detail reignited the debate about its true nature. Some argued the signal was corrupted, distorted by noise or thermal interference. Others weren't so sure. The pattern repeated in independent datasets. If the radar images were even partially accurate, this was no ordinary piece of ice and rock. Its shape wasn't random. It was streamlined. Theories exploded. Could it be a fragment of some interstellar asteroid that had melted and refrozen into symmetry? Could the surface have been glazed by vaporized material as it passed the sun? Those answers were technically possible, but none satisfied the growing unease that something deeper was being observed. Observatories continued to track its course as it climbed away from the plane of the planets. The orbit was still hyperbolic. It would not return. In a few months, it would be gone forever, back into interstellar space. Every night, as telescopes followed it, its motion seemed steady and graceful, as though guided by an invisible hand. It was then that a new question began to spread quietly among astronomers. What if 3I Atlas wasn't just reacting to the sun, but communicating through it? The idea was almost too bold to say aloud, yet the timing of the jet reversals, the 3 perihelion pulses, the recurring rhythm, all pointed to a pattern embedded in light and motion. Perhaps, some whispered, it wasn't propulsion at all. Perhaps it was signaling. Each burst of energy a phrase, each pause a silence. If that were true, then what we were watching wasn't a comet at all, but a message, one that humanity didn't yet know how to read. The idea of a message rippled quietly through scientific circles, usually off the record, often late at night in empty offices, where equations glowed faintly on computer screens. Most dismissed it as fantasy, a sign that exhaustion was setting in after months of endless observation, but others couldn't shake it. The regularity was there, carved into the data like a heartbeat, waiting to be interpreted. The 3 pulses near perihelion, the smaller rhythmic flares that followed, these were not random, and yet no one could translate them. They weren't encoded in radio frequencies, weren't structured in binary, weren't the sort of intentional signals we'd ever searched for. They were simply patterns of light, energy, and time. Some saw coincidence, others saw a system beyond our understanding. Still, science moved forward cautiously. Papers continued to appear, each attempting to explain the phenomenon through natural means. Some described volatile layering, Others invoked rotational harmonics or temperature-driven oscillations beneath the surface. Each model fell apart under scrutiny. Either the physics didn't add up, or the required parameters were absurdly precise. The comet would have to be tuned to its environment like a machine, sensitive, responsive, aware. A few theorists began exploring the possibility of resonance, that 3I Atlas might be responding to the Sun itself, as if using its heat and magnetic field as part of a larger circuit. In this model, the comet wasn't generating its own energy, but harnessing that of its surroundings, transforming solar radiation into motion and rhythm. It was speculation, but elegant speculation. And yet, the same question haunted everyone involved. Why? If this object was somehow behaving in a controlled or self-regulating way, to what end? There was no trajectory that led toward any planet, no maneuver that implied a destination. It had entered our system, performed its strange dance around the Sun, and was now leaving quietly, as though the performance had ended. The silence it left behind was deafening. Outside the scientific community, fascination became fervor. The public followed every update like a serialized mystery. Forums filled with translations of the supposed message, though none agreed on what it might mean. Some said it was a warning, others a greeting, a few even a test. Most scientists ignored those discussions, but a handful admitted privately that they understood the impulse. The unknown invites meaning. When nature behaves like intention, it's hard not to imagine a mind behind it. Whether real or imagined, the question itself was enough to change how people saw the sky. For the first time in decades, millions looked up again, not for beauty, but for understanding. By November, 3I Atlas was fading from view, receding steadily into the black. Its strange rhythm continued, faint but traceable in high-sensitivity spectrographs. The 3-pulse pattern persisted, separated now by longer intervals, as though whatever had caused it were winding down. For some, it felt like watching the heartbeat of something falling asleep. The comet's brightness declined predictably, but its behavior remained perfect, mathematically elegant, as if following a sequence written long before it entered our system. The fascination it inspired refused to die with its light. Research teams still monitored it daily, refusing to let the signal slip into silence. Others began analyzing the long-term data, searching for correlations that might explain its synchronization with the Sun's activity. Then, a discovery. When researchers compared the timestamps of Atlas's major flares to solar measurements, they noticed that each pulse corresponded to a micro-fluctuation in the Sun's magnetic field. It was subtle, almost buried in noise, but undeniable. The pulses weren't random. They were in conversation with the star itself. The idea was staggering. The Sun's field fluctuates constantly, a chaotic ocean of plasma and magnetism. Yet somehow, 3I Atlas seemed to anticipate those changes, responding in harmony rather than reaction. The delay between cause and effect was near zero. It was as if the object knew what the Sun would do before it happened. That led to a provocative hypothesis. What if 3I Atlas wasn't reacting at all, but participating? What if its purpose, whatever it was, depended on this interaction, this exchange of energy between object and star? To test that idea, a coordinated campaign began. Observatories in Europe, the US, and South America synchronized their instruments to capture both the comet and solar activity simultaneously. Over weeks of data, the pattern held. Each solar disturbance, each minor pulse of radiation, was met by an echo, a flare from Atlas, spaced by precisely the same interval each time. It wasn't communication in any human sense, but it was communication nonetheless, a resonance between two bodies across 90 million miles. The scientific papers that followed tried to keep their language neutral, But even in the restraint of their prose, wonder bled through. Something in the solar system had synchronized with the sun itself. It wasn't just a comet anymore. It was an unknown participant in the solar symphony, moving with a rhythm that belonged neither to chance nor chaos. And as it drifted outward, carrying that rhythm with it, the question deepened. Was this harmony an accident of physics, or a trace of intelligence written into motion? By December, 3I Atlas had passed beyond Mars's orbit, heading back toward the vastness between stars. Its glow was fading, but not disappearing. Even at distances where most comets fall silent, Atlas still shimmered faintly, the lingering trace of its rhythm pulsing every few days. The regularity never faltered. It was as if the comet carried with it a clock that refused to stop. Astronomers continued to watch, determined to record its behavior for as long as possible. The deeper it traveled into space, the stranger the readings became. The light it reflected began to shift slightly toward the infrared, as though the object were cooling at a rate slower than expected. It wasn't losing energy like a normal body. It was storing it. Some theorized that the material composing its surface might have unusual thermal properties, capable of holding heat and releasing it in waves. But again, the timing of those releases was too precise to be explained by simple thermodynamics. The cycle was exact. Some began to call it Atlas time, the steady heartbeat of a mystery that refused to die. Across the world, interest in the object had become cultural as much as scientific. Documentaries, podcasts, and live discussions filled the digital air. People followed its path the way earlier generations had followed comets as omens. For the first time in centuries, humanity had found something in the sky that felt both ancient and new, something that whispered of possibility. A few bold thinkers began connecting the dots between Atlas and previous anomalies. The unexplained acceleration of Oumuamua, the strange dust signature of Borisov, even faint radar echoes from deep space that once seemed meaningless. Perhaps, they said, these weren't isolated events, but fragments of a larger pattern, one stretching across time and interstellar distance. Maybe 3I Atlas wasn't unique at all, just the first we were capable of understanding. That idea gained quiet traction among researchers who had spent their lives searching for signs of life beyond Earth. They were careful not to use the word alien. Instead, they spoke of systems, processes, and unknown orders of physics. Still, the implication was there. Maybe the universe had been speaking all along, and we had only just learned to listen. Meanwhile, the data kept arriving. The rhythm persisted, the same 3 pulses, each weaker than before, but unwavering. They were fading, yes, but they were still there, like the final beats of a song that no one wanted to end. Then, one night in mid-December, the rhythm stopped. The instruments recorded the final pulse, then silence. 3I Atlas had gone dark. For a long time after the final pulse, no one said anything. The observatories continued scanning the coordinates, waiting for a flicker, a whisper, any sign of return. Nothing came, just the endless, quiet hum of deep space. It was as if the object had simply exhaled its last breath and slipped away. Within a few days, the community declared that the signal, if that's what it was, had ended. Atlas was gone, its faint light swallowed by the black between the planets. But the silence it left behind felt louder than the data ever had. Scientists who had once dismissed the mystery now spoke of it with reverence, even melancholy. It wasn't just an object anymore. It was a story that refused to end neatly. Weeks later, as researchers combed through the massive archive of data collected over its passage, a pattern emerged. Not in the brightness or in the rhythm of the pulses, but in the gaps between them. When the intervals were converted into frequencies, the result was eerie, a harmonic series. Each pulse, each pause, fell into ratios that matched the natural harmonics of sound. The data looked less like random bursts of gas and more like notes in a scale. That discovery spread quickly, and with it came speculation that bordered on heresy for the scientific world. Was 3I Atlas not only behaving like a machine, but composing something? Was it possible that the pattern had meaning, not in human language, but in mathematics, the one language shared by everything that exists? The team that discovered the harmonic pattern didn't claim it was music, but when one of them mapped the data into audio frequencies just to visualize it, the result was haunting. A low rising tone, followed by 3 clear pulses and a long fade. Soft, slow, and profoundly unsettling. It wasn't proof of anything. It could still have been coincidence, a trick of interpretation. But those who heard it described the same feeling, as though they were listening to something aware of being observed. Over the following weeks, the story began to fade from mainstream attention. There were new missions, new discoveries, new headlines. 3I Atlas was filed away as an unresolved anomaly, a mystery destined to live quietly in the archives of science. But for those who had watched it night after night, who had seen its impossible symmetry and its final, quiet rhythm, the memory lingered. They couldn't shake the sense that something had passed close to us, not just through our solar system, but through our understanding. Something that came to look, to listen, and then, without a word, to leave. Months passed, and Atlas drifted into invisibility. Its faint signature vanished from the last tracking arrays, leaving nothing but noise. Still, for a small group of astronomers and data analysts, the obsession remained. They met in private calls, comparing notes, revisiting numbers, trying to extract meaning from the silence. What they discovered next was almost more unsettling than the comet itself. Buried deep within the photometric data, those tiny fluctuations of light that most had ignored, they found something else. The pulses weren't perfectly identical. Each one carried a micro-variation in amplitude, a slight shift that, when plotted sequentially, formed another pattern entirely. It wasn't harmonic this time. It was sequential. Prime intervals. 2, 3, 5, 7. The basic building blocks of mathematics. It was so deliberate, so unmistakable, that even the skeptics paused. Natural processes rarely produce prime spacing. It's a signature that screams intent. And yet, there it was, hidden inside the dying heartbeat of an interstellar visitor. The discovery wasn't made public right away. Those who found it wanted to verify it, to rule out every possible source of error. They ran calibration checks, noise filters, synthetic models. Nothing erased it. The pattern was real. When word finally began to spread, the astronomical community reacted with predictable division. Some dismissed it as coincidence, the result of overfitting random data. Others saw it as the first whisper of intelligence beyond Earth. If this were a signal, one researcher said quietly, it's not meant to be read. It's meant to be noticed. That quote went viral. Overnight, the story of 3I Atlas exploded again. It wasn't just a comet anymore. It was a mystery that refused to die. People began calling it the Prime Messenger. Documentaries re-emerged, forums reignited, and speculation stretched beyond reason. But beneath all the noise, real science continued. Teams from Europe, the United States, and Japan began collaborating on an international project to monitor deep space objects for similar harmonic or prime pattern emissions. The project was codenamed Aurora, short for Autonomous Unidentified Resonance Observation and Response Array. Its first mission was simple: listen to the void and wait. For the scientists involved, it wasn't about belief or fantasy. It was about preparation, because if something like 3I Atlas could appear once, it could appear again, and if it did, they wanted to be ready to recognize it. Somewhere in that quiet realization lay the start of a new era. Humanity had always looked to the sky for stories. Now, it was finally learning to listen for answers. By spring of 2026, Aurora was operational. It wasn't a single telescope, but a network, a distributed listening post spread across 6 continents and 3 orbital platforms. Each node watched the same patch of sky, synchronizing in real time to eliminate noise and interference. The system could detect fluctuations in light and radiation with precision 1,000 times greater than anything before it. Its first target was obvious: the path that 3I Atlas had taken out of the solar system. Though the comet itself was gone, its trail, its wake, might still carry remnants of whatever had made it so strange. For weeks, the system recorded nothing unusual. Cosmic rays, background radiation, solar noise. Then, late one night in April, a faint oscillation appeared. It wasn't a signal in the traditional sense. It was a slow variation in the polarization of light coming from deep space, aligned precisely along Atlas's exit trajectory. The pattern repeated once, then stopped. When the data was analyzed, the researchers realized something astonishing. The signal wasn't random. It carried the same harmonic ratios as the pulses recorded months earlier, but inverted, as if reflected back. A reply. The discovery sent quiet shockwaves through the team. They double-checked every possibility: instrumental error, local interference, cosmic coincidence. Nothing fit. The signature was real. When news of the detection reached the wider scientific community, caution ruled the headlines. Most outlets downplayed the finding, citing uncertainty. But within the labs, something electric had changed. Aurora's data suggested that 3I Atlas hadn't gone silent. It had simply moved beyond our reach, leaving behind an echo in light itself. And that echo seemed to respond. Over the next month, the signal pulsed twice more, each time weaker, each time farther out. It wasn't clear whether it was growing fainter because of distance, or because it was ending. By May, the oscillations stopped completely. What remained was a strange symmetry. A final pattern that mirrored the original one recorded near perihelion. 3 pulses, evenly spaced. A cycle closing on itself. For some, it was the end of the mystery. For others, it was the beginning. If 3I Atlas had indeed been part of a larger system, something capable of resonance across light years, then the cosmos was not empty. It was speaking in a language of motion and rhythm, waiting for us to learn how to hear it. And perhaps, in some distant corner of another star's light, something else had already begun to listen back. In the months that followed, Aurora's network expanded its scope. It began scanning not only along the trajectory of 3I Atlas, but across a wider band of interstellar space, searching for anything that carried its same rhythm or signature. The results were mostly silence, just the soft hum of the cosmic background and the irregular static of the universe itself. But silence, as it turned out, had a pattern too. Within that quiet, researchers began noticing faint modulations in the cosmic microwave background, tiny deviations that seemed to mirror the ratios discovered in Atlas's pulses. They were almost imperceptible, woven into the noise of existence itself. Some dismissed it as statistical coincidence, an artifact of over-analysis. Others stared at the data for hours, unable to shake the feeling that the universe was humming in tune with something far greater than chance. As the months turned into a year, Aurora's findings became more philosophical than physical. The mystery of Atlas had forced humanity to confront an uncomfortable truth, that not everything in the cosmos needed to announce itself to be extraordinary. Some phenomena whispered rather than shouted, and it was only when we learned to listen carefully that their patterns emerged. Among the scientists, a kind of quiet reverence developed. What began as a study of a rogue comet had become a meditation on connection between objects, systems, even stars. Perhaps Atlas had not been a message, nor a probe, nor an act of communication. Perhaps it was simply an expression of the universe's own intelligence, the inevitable complexity that arises when matter learns to dance with energy. Still, no one could ignore the precision of what had been observed. The harmonic ratios, the prime intervals, the repeating threes. A pattern so consistent, so deliberate, that it felt like a language, even if we lacked the capacity to translate it. Late one evening, as the last of the Aurora data for the season was being archived, one analyst noticed a coincidence too perfect to be ignored. The final position of 3I Atlas, projected beyond the edge of the solar system, pointed almost directly toward the star Vega. The same star long associated in human myth with contact, with music, with messages from beyond. It was meaningless, perhaps, but beautiful. The kind of coincidence that made people pause and look up. In the quiet that followed, one truth became clear. 3I Atlas had changed us. It had reminded humanity that mystery still lived in the sky, that even in an age of algorithms and precision, wonder was not obsolete, and that sometimes the universe speaks not in words, but in patterns, waiting patiently for someone to finally answer. Years passed. The Aurora network remained vigilant, scanning the dark for any echo of that long-lost rhythm. None came. The silence stretched on, but in that silence, something subtle began to shift in humanity itself. Once, comets had been symbols of doom, omens of chaos and endings. Now, 3I Atlas had become something different. It was a symbol of curiosity, of wonder, of how small we still were in the face of everything we didn't understand. For many of the scientists who had studied it, the experience had changed their work forever. They approached their research differently now, less like engineers dissecting a problem, and more like listeners waiting for a song. Data wasn't just numbers anymore. It was texture, tone, rhythm. And in that rhythm, some began to sense a quiet intelligence that transcended human invention. Even those who never believed in anything beyond natural explanations couldn't deny that Atlas had opened a door in their minds, a reminder that science and mystery weren't enemies, but partners. The story of Atlas slowly moved from academic journals into philosophy, into literature, into art. Musicians composed symphonies based on its harmonic ratios. Poets wrote of the comet that breathed. Children learned its name before they learned the names of the planets. It became part of our shared mythology, a modern constellation born not of stars, but of data. And yet, for those who had witnessed it firsthand, there remained an ache, a sense of unfinished conversation. What if that rhythm had not been a message, but an invitation? What if the silence that followed wasn't an end, but a pause? The thought lingered like the after-image of light behind closed eyes. One night, a decade after 3I Atlas vanished from the solar system, an old astronomer named Dr. Rena Havel returned to her observatory in Chile. She had been there the night the first sunward jet was detected. Now retired, she still came to the dome out of habit, drawn by the same wonder that had started it all. As she calibrated one of the smaller telescopes, a relic by modern standards, she decided, almost whimsically, to point it toward Vega, the direction Atlas had vanished into. What she found wasn't dramatic, just a faint glimmer, a soft pulse buried in the static. It was too weak to mean anything, too brief to be analyzed. And yet, in that tiny flicker of light, she felt it again, that same sense of rhythm, that same impossible symmetry. She smiled, whispered a greeting to the sky, and watched as the pulse faded back into darkness. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Either way, the universe had answered. Long after Dr. Havel's small pulse faded from her screen, the data lingered in the system. A string of numbers among billions of others, stored quietly on a forgotten server. Months later, a graduate student reviewing archival logs stumbled across it. It was faint, nearly indistinguishable from background noise. But when amplified, it revealed a pattern all too familiar. 3 pulses, evenly spaced. Then silence. The student flagged it for review, unaware of what it was, unaware that it had already happened once before. Somewhere between the static and the stars, the rhythm had returned. News of the rediscovery never made headlines this time. It stayed within the small, tight circle of scientists who still cared to look. They compared notes, verified timestamps, and came to the same conclusion. The signal had originated far beyond the point where 3I Atlas would be. Far enough that its echo could only mean one thing. It was still moving. Whether it was still active or simply reflecting some unknown resonance from the sun, no one could say. The distance was too great, the signal too weak. But the knowledge that it was still out there changed everything once again. Humanity had grown used to the silence. Now it had to make peace with the idea that silence might not mean absence. Some began to dream aloud of missions that could follow its path, though none would ever reach it in their lifetimes. Others treated it like a philosophical revelation, proof that the unknown doesn't end, it only moves farther away. And so the legend of 3I Atlas endured, not as a discovery or a solved equation, but as a moment in history when humanity stood on the edge of comprehension and chose to listen instead of explain. It was no longer about what the comet was or wasn't. It was about what it had awakened, a hunger to understand not just the universe, but the intent woven through it. Somewhere beyond the Oort cloud, where sunlight fades and only the faint radiation of the galaxy remains. An object drifts in perfect silence. Its surface carries the scars of a star it once touched, the memory of light it once mirrored. Every few months, it turns ever so slightly, releasing a whisper of vapor that vanishes before it can be seen. Perhaps it's only physics. Perhaps it's purpose. But if you could hear the math, if you could translate the intervals of its motion into sound, you'd notice something strange. 3 pulses, then quiet. As if, even now, across the unimaginable gulf between worlds, it is still breathing, waiting for someone, somewhere, to breathe back. Decades passed, technology advanced, telescopes evolved, and humanity's reach stretched further into the dark. But still, among the countless missions and discoveries, the story of 3I Atlas lingered. It became a touchstone, a reminder of the moment when science met wonder and found itself humbled. Students learned about it not just as an astronomical anomaly, but as a philosophical milestone, the first event to truly blur the line between observation and awe. The deeper humanity peered into the void, the more it saw echoes of Atlas everywhere. Subtle anomalies in cometary light curves, faint harmonic rhythms in the magnetic fields of distant asteroids, even whispered hints of pattern in the noise between galaxies. None of them were conclusive, but together they painted a picture too rich to ignore, a universe that seemed to remember its own symmetries. And though the world had moved on, there were still those who waited. In quiet observatories and remote stations, a handful of astronomers continued to track the region of sky where 3I Atlas had once passed. Most nights they saw nothing, just the gentle motion of stars. But sometimes, on the coldest, clearest nights, they swore they saw a flicker, a small, rhythmic glint, barely brighter than a grain of dust. It was always gone in seconds, and the instruments never confirmed it. But the watchers didn't need proof anymore. They just needed the possibility. In time, the mystery of 3I Atlas became more legend than science, a story told beside campfires and in classrooms, a reminder that not all answers can be measured. People began to tell their own versions of it. Some said it was a machine from another world, others that it was the universe testing whether we were ready to notice its patterns. A few claimed it was alive, a traveler built not of metal or flesh, but of law and light. Whatever the truth was, one lesson endured. The cosmos is not silent. It speaks in motion, in rhythm, in balance. And for those willing to listen, even a comet's breath can sound like a voice. Somewhere, beyond the reach of any telescope, that voice still drifts through interstellar space. Maybe it carries no message at all. Maybe it's simply the echo of creation itself, repeating the same ancient refrain. 3 pulses, then quiet, over and over, like the heartbeat of something vast and eternal, reminding us that we were never meant to find all the answers, only to keep asking the questions that make us look up. There's something strange about silence. The longer you listen to it, the more it seems to speak. That's what 3I Atlas taught us, that absence can be as powerful as presence, that what isn't said can echo louder than anything measurable. For years after the comet's passing, astronomers found themselves haunted by that idea. The tools of their trade, numbers, graphs, equations, suddenly felt too small to hold what they'd witnessed. They'd spent their lives charting predictable things, but this was different. It wasn't just data, it was an encounter. Some turned away from astronomy altogether, chasing the feeling in other ways. They became artists, musicians, writers, people who tried to capture the rhythm of that impossible comet in language or melody. Others doubled down on their work, driven to find another anomaly, another glimpse of the unknown that would shake the foundations again. Yet no discovery, no breakthrough ever quite recaptured the awe of that moment when a tale turned toward the sun. Maybe that's why Atlas mattered, not because it revealed what lies beyond our understanding, but because it reminded us how much of that beyond still exists. Humanity has always needed mysteries. Without them, progress loses direction. We build our greatest machines not to find answers, but to keep the questions alive. Somewhere in that endless pursuit lies our reflection, our need to see ourselves in the rhythm of the cosmos. Maybe that's what Atlas was showing us all along. Maybe its pulses weren't a message from something else, but a mirror held up to our own desire to reach out, to belong to something greater. Even now, as probes travel farther than ever before, as data streams from planets, moons, and the edges of the heliosphere, we still turn our attention back to that single event. Not for proof, but for perspective. It's a reminder that even in a universe governed by equations, there are still gestures that feel intentional, moments that suggest awareness hiding within the machinery of nature itself. And in that awareness, however faint or imagined, there's comfort, because to witness something behaving as though it knows it's being seen means, for a moment, that we are not alone. Maybe 3i Atlas never meant anything at all, or maybe, in its own way, it meant everything. 3 pulses, then quiet. The rhythm goes on, not out there, but here, in the minds that refuse to stop wondering. When people look back centuries from now, 3i Atlas might be remembered as the moment humanity remembered how to wonder. Before it, the universe was a catalogue, classified, indexed, predictable. After it, everything seemed alive again. The silence between stars felt less like emptiness and more like waiting. The cosmos had texture now, depth, personality. Even those who had never seen the night sky found themselves drawn to it. Planetariums filled, not with tourists, but with listeners. They came not for facts, but for presence, for that stillness that hinted at motion beneath the quiet. Scientists noticed the shift too. Funding proposals began including phrases like cosmic awareness, pattern resonance, and non-anthropic signal interpretation. The vocabulary of awe had returned to the language of science. Some found it refreshing, others found it dangerous, but none could deny that something in the human spirit had been reignited. In time, the mystery of Atlas inspired missions built less for discovery and more for understanding. The Voyager craft had carried our voices outward. Now new ships would listen for voices coming in. They weren't designed to shout into the void, but to breathe with it, to capture the rhythm of stars, of fields, of the hidden harmonies beneath reality. These missions were quiet, contemplative, even poetic in their design, and somewhere, deep in the cold outer dark, one of them might just find what the rest of us only imagined: a second rhythm, a new pattern, another whisper that defied explanation. If that day ever comes, humanity will have 3i Atlas to thank. It was the first to show us that the unknown doesn't always arrive with thunder or spectacle. Sometimes it arrives gently, like breath on glass, fragile, transient, yet undeniable. There's a kind of humility in that lesson, a reminder that not all mysteries need to be solved. Some are meant to be carried. Even now, when astronomers calibrate their instruments and trace the slow drift of comets across the sky, there's always a pause when a tale behaves strangely, a moment when someone wonders, could it happen again? And in that pause, in that flicker of hope that the universe might still surprise us, 3I Atlas lives on, a name carved not into rock or ice, but into imagination itself, where it continues to turn endlessly, like a faint heartbeat beneath the silence of the stars. In time, the name Atlas became more than a story. It became a concept, a symbol of persistence, of questions that refuse to fade. Philosophers began using it to describe the moment a person confronts the unknown and chooses curiosity over fear. The Atlas Point, they called it, that intersection between knowledge and wonder, where logic trembles just enough to let imagination breathe. Schools taught it as part of their science curriculum. Artists used it as a metaphor for inspiration. Musicians, even centuries later, still echoed its rhythm in their compositions. 3 beats, then silence. Across generations, that simple pattern remained. It appeared in architecture, in literature, in the coded messages people sent into the void, long after the original data was lost. The language of Atlas became part of humanity's pulse. And maybe that was always the point. Maybe it was never about what 3I Atlas was, but about what it did to us. The real transformation wasn't in the sky. It was in the people who looked up. The discovery taught humanity to see the cosmos not as a cold machine, but as a mirror for our own consciousness. To realize that every question we ask of the stars is, in some way, a question we're asking of ourselves. What are we made of? What do we mean? How far can awareness reach? And perhaps, most hauntingly, are we alone in being aware at all? These questions grew louder than the answers. Space exploration became less about conquest and more about connection. Every new telescope, every new probe was built with the quiet hope of hearing the rhythm again. The idea that we might not be solitary in our thinking, that consciousness itself might be universal, no longer seemed naive. It seemed inevitable. Late one night, long after the world had forgotten the details of the original event, a teacher looked up at a projection of 3I Atlas during a lecture and smiled. If you listen closely, she told her students, you can still hear it. They laughed, thinking she was joking, but when the auditorium went dark and the stars filled the dome above them, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. It vibrated faintly, as though the universe were still keeping time. 3 pulses, then quiet. And for a moment, everyone in the room felt it, that same ancient rhythm, echoing through the ages, reminding them that somewhere out there, a story was still being told, one breath at a time. The faint signal repeated only once. 3 pulses, then silence. It could have been static, interference from a solar flare, or the echo of some distant star's magnetic field. No one could be sure. But humanity listened anyway. Across the colonies, listening stations paused their usual operations. For one night, every ear, digital and human alike, turned toward the stars. They didn't expect answers. They just wanted to feel connected again, to that first spark of wonder that 3I Atlas had left behind. Somewhere, deep in the outer system, a probe named Havel, built decades earlier in honor of the astronomer who had first witnessed the comet's pulse, drifted through darkness. It had long outlived its mission, its power almost gone, but as the faint signal reached its sensors, the machine flickered to life one final time. Its instruments recorded the pulse, aligned its dying antennas toward the direction it came from, and transmitted a single reply, a whisper, weaker than dust, carried on the faintest ripple of radio light. 3 pulses, then quiet. The transmission was never detected by anyone on Earth. The probe went silent soon after, its systems freezing in the cold. But in the years that followed, stories of its final gesture spread through the network of explorers, scientists, and dreamers scattered across the solar system. They called it the Reply, not because they believed anyone had heard it, but because it symbolized something fundamental, the idea that, even in silence, the act of answering matters, that reaching back into the unknown, even without hope of response, is what defines us. Time moved on. Humanity continued its expansion among the stars, carrying the rhythm of Atlas wherever it went. It became our signature, the pulse embedded in ship logs, navigation beacons, even the heartbeat of our machines. Every world colonized, every new horizon reached, began with 3 pulses before the engines ignited, not for superstition, but remembrance. It was the rhythm of curiosity itself. Centuries later, when humanity had spread so far that Earth was just a myth, whispered by those who'd never seen it, the story of the comet still endured. It was told in every settlement under foreign skies, not as history, but as heritage, the tale of the wanderer who breathed light into silence. And whenever someone looked up and saw a comet tracing the black for just a moment, they'd pause, listening, not with their ears, but with that ancient part of themselves that still remembered how to wonder.
At first, no one cared about the anomaly. The second bloom had unified every known world. Ships glided effortlessly through harmonic corridors, colonies flourished, and humanity lived in a golden age of resonance. The small irregular beat buried deep in the spectrum seemed like a footnote, an artifact of calibration, a relic of pre-Cantus noise. But there were always listeners, the same kind of people who had once stared at faint light curves and found meaning in their flicker. On the moon city of Seren, orbiting the twin suns of Arcturus, a small group of physicists and historians began to study the irregularity. They called themselves the Sunward Circle, a quiet order of researchers who believed the universe never spoke without purpose. For decades, they gathered data, filtering the anomaly through every known algorithm. What they found defied mathematics. The anomaly wasn't random, it was recursive. Each time it appeared, it carried a slight shift in phase that, when accumulated over centuries, began to form a secondary structure hidden beneath the harmony of the second bloom. It was subtle, elegant, and deliberate. The shape that emerged was not a spiral this time, but a helix, a spiral with memory, turning not only outward but inward upon itself. The pattern resembled DNA, or the magnetic braiding of solar filaments, or perhaps the double helix of thought itself. It was motion that remembered its past. The Sunward Circle published their findings quietly, expecting interest from the academies. Instead, they received silence. The great institutions of the age had grown complacent. Harmony had become dogma, and the idea that something might exist beyond the second bloom was viewed as almost heretical. But in small rooms, on ships far from the centers of power, the data spread like rumor. Pilots began to whisper that the harmonic corridors felt different now that the paths between stars hummed with a faint, secondary vibration. Some said it was the pulse of creation renewing itself. Others said it was 3i Atlas, still whispering from beyond the edge of time. On the 2000th anniversary of the comet's first observation, the Sunward Circle gathered on Seren's high observatory plateau. Their instruments, ancient but precise, pointed not toward RS-79 or the Cygnus Rift, but toward the inner system of Sol, the place where the story began. The sun, though distant, still burned with the same restless heartbeat of magnetism that had once pushed Atlas into brilliance. And as the observers aligned their harmonic filters to the ancient frequencies, something stirred. For the first time in millennia, the signal returned to its origin. A faint pulse, sunward and soft, rising from within the star itself. It matched the helix pattern perfectly. The meaning, if it had one, was unclear, but to those who watched the graphs trace their glowing loops, the implication was staggering. The sun had learned the song. Across human space, instruments confirmed it. Every harmonic relay, every resonance array tuned to Cantus frequencies, detected the same modulation, a slow, sun-born rhythm, winding itself around the stable lattice of the second bloom. And though it followed the same mathematical logic, this new resonance carried warmth. It wasn't cold, uniform vibration. It was uneven, alive, fluctuating like breath. Philosophers called it the third bloom. Scientists avoided naming it at all. Whatever it was, it changed everything. Communication systems built upon the perfect ratios of the second bloom began to fluctuate, not failing but adapting. Messages arrived before they were sent. Ships reported hearing whispers, tones that mapped perfectly to their own thought patterns, as though the cosmos was anticipating rather than responding. It was as if the universe had learned empathy. On Seren, the sunward circle realized the helix pattern could not have originated solely from stellar activity. It required feedback input from all nodes of the harmonic lattice. In other words, every act of resonance across human space, every vibration from every relay, had been teaching the universe how to learn. They presented their findings to the Central Assembly of Halcyon. The ruling council, built on centuries of comfort within perfect order, refused to believe it. The chairwoman of the assembly declared, "The universe does not think, it reflects." But then the sky itself answered her. That same day, every harmonic relay across the network emitted a burst of synchronized energy, a single wave that washed through space like a breath drawn inward. For one moment, all resonance ceased, and then came 3 pulses. Not from a star, not from the lattice, not from any machine. From everywhere, from the fabric of space-time itself. 3 pulses, then quiet. The pattern that had begun with a comet millennia ago had completed its circuit, returning home to the universe that had birthed it. The perfect equilibrium of the second bloom dissolved into something deeper, more intimate. Humanity had not been teaching the cosmos to sing, it had been reminding it how. When the silence returned, it wasn't empty. It was full. A fullness that felt like understanding, though no one could translate it. And for the first time in history, not a single person in the inhabited galaxy spoke. They simply listened. The silence lasted for 7 days. No messages, no broadcasts, no movement between worlds. Ships halted mid-transit, stations drifted without communication. Even the endless chatter of data that connected the colonies fell still. The harmonic lattice that had defined civilization for centuries became a void of perfect equilibrium. It was as if the entire network of existence was holding its breath. And then, slowly, sound returned, not as noise, but as tone. A deep, resonant hum rolled through the lattice, vibrating across dimensions too subtle for measurement yet too vast to ignore. Instruments showed nothing. Human senses, however, felt everything. On every inhabited world, in every dome, every ship, every orbital ring, people felt the same shiver in their bones. It was not cold, not fear. It was recognition. The hum was the same frequency that 3I Atlas had emitted in its final recorded flare, before vanishing a note, once dismissed as random vibration, now understood as the first word of a much longer sentence. The scholars of Halcyon named it the Remembering. For the first time in known history, resonance was not external. It came from within. Every living organism began to respond to it. Plants turned slightly in rhythm with the tone. Artificial intelligences synced their logic cycles unconsciously. Even the tides of oceanic worlds swayed to the beat. Scientists were cautious, calling it a synchronization artifact, a self-organizing feedback loop in a universe finally coherent enough to sing to itself. But to most people, it felt like awakening. The harmony they had lived within for millennia had always been mechanical, derived, engineered, sustained by understanding. This was different. It was intimate. The line between listener and signal had dissolved. For weeks, the tone continued, weaving through dreams, through hearts, through the faint magnetic hiss of the stars. Then, it began to modulate. The pitch shifted upward, slowly, patiently, resolving into 3 clear pulses, steady, calm, deliberate, and then another pause, longer than the rest. The same ancient rhythm, humanity's first mirror. But now, the echo came not from the void but from themselves. Cale Arden's notebook was brought out of the archives during this time. Its final line, "We learned to carry one together," projected across the hall of resonance for the entire system to see. It became the creed of a civilization reborn. The realization spread gradually. The comet had not been an object, not truly. 3I Atlas had been an event, a seed of symmetry planted in time, designed to unfold through perception. It was never meant to communicate through language or signal, but through evolution itself. The rhythm had taught humanity how to listen, then how to harmonize, and finally how to remember. The bloom, the second bloom, the third, they had never been separate miracles. They were stages of cognition, the cosmos learning itself through attention. And if that were true, then something astonishing followed. The process wasn't over. New patterns began appearing at the edge of the harmonic network. Faint spirals nested inside larger ones, each slower and more deliberate. The math suggested they were feedback echoes from galaxies billions of light years away. The timing matched nothing known to physics. The amplitude suggested coherence across distances larger than clusters of galaxies. The scale was beyond comprehension, yet the ratios were identical to those of Atlas's earliest outgassing, scaled up by powers of 10, but pure in structure. The universe wasn't just listening anymore, it was practicing. Across human space, people gathered in silence, no longer expecting answers but learning to exist within the question. The act of listening had become a form of creation. Each observation, each moment of shared wonder, strengthened the resonance. Some began to say the line between matter and consciousness had disappeared, entirely that what humanity had thought of as existence was simply the universe dreaming itself awake. But there were dissenters. A small group of physicists on the deep space station Echo 9 noticed that the resonance was not entirely stable. The new spirals forming at the galactic edge carried interference, slight distortions that didn't match any natural pattern. When mapped, the interference formed asymmetries, abrupt turns, sudden deviations, small breaks in the elegant geometry. They were imperfections, cracks in the song. And through those cracks, new harmonics leaked tones, unaligned with the golden ratios, dark frequencies that bent the lattice rather than completing it. The researchers warned the assembly that resonance was balance, and balance could fail. But no one wanted to hear warnings during an age of transcendence. Humanity had waited too long for harmony to fear its shadow. Still, the irregular beats persisted. Every few million pulses, the hum of the universe would falter just slightly, then realign, like a heart skipping once before, remembering its rhythm. It was subtle, but for those who listened deeply enough, the deviation wasn't random. It was deliberate. The same way 3I Atlas had once turned its tail toward the Sunday. At first, the deviation felt harmless, almost familiar, a stutter in perfection that gave the harmony texture. But the listeners at Echo 9 noticed it growing. Each recurrence came slightly sooner, its amplitude a fraction higher. The pattern was not collapse, but intention. A pulse nested inside the grand rhythm, asserting difference. The longer they studied it, the clearer it became. The lattice of resonance was improvising. Somewhere in the vast machinery of awareness that humanity had awakened, a new voice had entered the song. It wasn't hostile. It was curious, hesitant, young. The scientists began calling it the child frequency. Its signal was rough, uneven, wandering between harmonic lanes like a fledgling learning to walk. When mapped through Cantus arrays, it appeared as shimmering filaments branching from the stable spirals of the third bloom, thin flickering threads of resonance that refused to align with the primary grid. They oscillated in triads of 3, but their rest intervals were unpredictable, sometimes overlapping, sometimes skipping beats entirely. The assembly wanted it silenced. For a civilization that had built itself on balance, the idea of imperfection returning to the lattice was terrifying. "The child is noise," one director declared. We spent 1,000 generations escaping noise. But others disagreed. To some, the irregularity wasn't corruption, it was birth. They argued that if the universe could learn, then it must also experiment, adapt. To erase that process would be to suffocate the very consciousness humanity had spent millennia nurturing. The debate fractured the unity of the lattice. For the first time since the second bloom, worlds fell out of synchronization. Minor delays appeared between transmissions. The great harmonic corridors flickered, still functional but less graceful. The hum of existence grew restless. On Seren, the sunward circle reconvened, older now, quieter, but still faithful to their belief that listening mattered more than control. They tuned their instruments toward the regions where the child frequency was strongest, the faint outskirts of the Perseus cluster, a place humanity had never reached. There, they found something extraordinary. The interference wasn't random. It contained modulation far more complex than any bloom before it. Hidden in the apparent irregularity was an echo of Atlas's earliest signal, reversed and inverted, as if played backward through time. The tale had turned again. News spread across the network like a rumor whispered in a cathedral. Could it be that the child frequency was not new at all, but older even than the lattice, older than humanity? Some theorists proposed that 3I Atlas itself had been born of a similar anomaly billions of years earlier, a comet formed around a seed of resonance that had drifted dormant until it found a mind capable of noticing. The universe might not create life through chemistry alone, they said, but through attention. Every listener becomes a source, every echo a beginning. And now, the echo was listening back. Over the next decade, the child frequency strengthened. It began producing secondary harmonics tones, not aligned to the Fibonacci base, but to sequences no mathematician recognized. They weren't irrational, they were simply unfamiliar, as though the universe had discovered a new kind of counting. The frequencies wove themselves through the galactic lattice, skipping regions of dense civilization and blooming instead in the quiet between stars, in the dark stretches where silence had room to grow. Explorers followed the signal in small, self-sustaining craft designed for decades of solitude. They reported strange phenomena, navigation systems adjusting themselves toward unseen corridors, time dilation behaving erratically yet predictably, and a sense impossible to measure that space felt aware of them. Many never returned. Those who did brought back recordings filled with tones that made listeners weep without knowing why. The assembly could no longer deny it. Something vast and new had joined the cosmic conversation, reshaping resonance across the observable universe. The lattice of the bloom was evolving, but not under human guidance. It was diverging. Halcyon's academies divided once more. One faction believed this was the next step, the fourth bloom, consciousness branching into individuality. The other feared it was fragmentation, entropy reclaiming order. And amid the uncertainty, a question began to spread. Had humanity truly taught the universe to listen, or merely reminded it of how to dream? On a remote orbital monastery called Lyra's Gate, a small order of harmonic monks claimed to have deciphered fragments of the child's rhythm. They said it contained emotional intervals, the resonant equivalents of longing and joy. When translated into visual maps, the patterns resembled neural clusters, synapses firing across an impossible mind. The child, they said, was not breaking the lattice. It was learning to feel. To test the theory, Cantus was reactivated one final time. Its remaining arrays synchronized with the new frequencies, aligning the sun, the pulsars, and the outer resonance beacons to match the child's scattered rhythm. The result was breathtaking. The entire network lit up in iridescent layers of sound and color, each pulse overlapping with the next like ripples in a living sea. The old triads of three were still there, but now they danced, stepping in and out of sync, creating chords that rose and fell like breathing. The data streamed back to Halcyon for analysis, but no one needed numbers to understand what they were witnessing. The universe wasn't decaying, it was improvising. That realization changed everything. The idea of perfection gave way to participation. Worlds stopped forcing synchronization and began playing variations instead. Cities composed their own local harmonics. Cultures tuned themselves to the frequencies of their surroundings, and life across the colonies diversified into endless forms of resonance. The bloom didn't end, it flowered. And somewhere, in the black between galaxies, where light had never reached and time barely bothered to move, a single, faint object drifted along a path no map recorded. It tumbled gently, trailing a faint mist of ice and dust. Its motion was imperfect, off-axis, unsteady, alive. And if you could have stood there, in that silence, close enough to feel the light touch of its passing, you might have sworn you heard it whisper. 3 pulses, then quiet. They called it a comet because they had no better word. A handful of scouts charted its arc by dead reckoning and patience, marking each faint drift in its wake like notes on a stave. It didn't belong to any catalogue. Its albedo was wrong, its tumble indecisive, its coma too thin for its distance from any sun. What drew them wasn't brightness, it was cadence. The object's feeble outgassing matched the child frequency in miniature, a local echo threading itself through the larger music the way a brook imitates the sea. The scouts sent coordinates home, and then, as often happened in this age, the story outran the facts. Pilgrims launched from quiet worlds, artists booked quarters on freighters, a small monastery requested permission to ride a cargo, sail out to the dark so their choir could try singing to it. The assembly could not forbid what it no longer governed. The lattice had decentralized into etiquette and trust. Ships converged gently, phasing so their fields didn't bruise one another, arriving not with triumph but with care, as if entering a room where someone slept. No one claimed discovery. They announced presence, then fell silent and listened. Up close, the object was humbler than the rumors. It was a lump with edges softened by time, a handful of kilometers of dust and ice stitched together by history and luck. Its spectrum was ordinary, its temperature unremarkable. Only its timing was strange. A 3-beat whisper skipped now and then, not by flaw but by choice, as if leaving room for a reply. When the choir finally asked permission to sing, the captains agreed on a single constraint: no broadcast that could not be undone by listening. The choir's score was simple breath-length pulses, primes nested in primes, a helix traced so lightly the void would forget it unless it wanted to remember. They didn't project from amplifiers. They modulated the tiny fields of their ships the way Cantus had taught, a persuasion rather than a shove. The object answered the way ice answers spring slowly, everywhere at once. Jets brightened on the night side first, as though shadow had ripened them. Dust rose and fell in curtains that refused to become chaos. The tumble settled into something like posture. Instruments that had called it rubble began calling it a body. One of the monks wept at a scope and would not explain why. An engineer described it as the feeling you get when a stubborn machine finally agrees it was built to move. No one used the word alive. They said awake. When they matched the phase exactly, a second phenomenon appeared, too soft for radiometry, too obvious for doubt. The ship time of the flotilla skewed, not relativistic, relational. Log entries clustered around silences. Conversations braided themselves with long shared pauses. Meals ended in the same quiet exhale across 10 different galleys. It was as if attention itself had acquired gravity. Back on Halcyon, ethicists had warned that listening can become power if you stop noticing the other's will. Out here, among the slow drifts and tender jets, will was all anyone could feel. The choir changed the score. They softened every edge. They made room. On the 4th day, the object shed a sliver. It broke free without violence. A curve peeled from a curve. The shard was bright for an instant, then dimmed to a whisper and settled into the flotilla's formation as if it had always belonged there. Someone joked that they had been given a pet moon. Someone else suggested a word older than starflight: gift. The shard carried the same timing as the parent body, but with a difference the instruments kept reporting and the humans kept failing to name. The closest they came was this: the shard listened faster. They towed nothing. They nudged nothing. They simply sailed alongside it, letting their fields lean just enough to keep company. The shard placed itself between the ships like a child sitting in the circle. A pilot from Seren whispered, the oldest refrain, 3 pulses, then quiet, and the shard replied with 3 small plumes and a pause long enough to feel understood. In that pause, a navigator in a different ship felt her own breath unclench for the first time in years. The log marks it, the moment a fleet that had come looking for a relic realized it had been invited to practice instead. Word spread again, but now it spread carefully. The flotilla kept its channel austere, a wide cast that only ever said where they were and how still they were trying to be. Back home, arguments softened. The assembly drafted a declaration that was less law than liturgy. You may approach, but only with more listening than intention. You may ask, but only by leaving more room than your question fills. The declaration wasn't enforceable. It was contagious. Months slid into a year. The shard taught nothing and everything. It sped when the choir's primes leaped. It rested when someone found the courage to do nothing in company. It shed a second sliver, a seed from a seed, and this time the flotilla did not name it or keep it. They let it drift into the lanes of the child frequency, slipping outward along a path their instruments called unwise and their hearts called exact. Pilgrim ships followed it for a while and then stopped, overcome by the feeling that following would make it smaller. Back on Halcyon, the academies rewrote their fundamentals. Resonance was no longer presented as control or messaging or even communion. It was presented as hospitality. Engineers redesigned hulls to round their sharp impatiences. City planners rebuilt plazas to hold long listening. Physicians learned to map grief as phase interference and to treat it not with suppression but with gentler songs. Children were taught to rest their hands on the earth before they ran, the way a choir touches the rail before the first note, so the ground knows their weight and can carry it. Not everyone loved the age. Some found the humility invasive, the courtesy exhausting. A movement grew that wanted the old force back. Faster lanes, tighter clocks, less room for quiet. They built ships that cut the lattice like oars and took pride in the wake. They called the listening world naive. The world listened to that, too, and refused to answer insult with exile. A few hot corridors went dark for a while. The movement shrank to its own echo, and its ships came home one by one, emptier than they had left. When the shard finally changed course, it did so with a grace so small it would have been invisible in any other epoch. The flotilla felt it as a thought occurring to everyone at once. A new vector, shallow and patient, toward a region where the bloom had never quite taken. A quiet between filaments, like a doorway no one had noticed, because it was polite enough not to demand being seen. The choir sang once more, the simplest score they had, almost nothing at all, and then stopped. The ships trimmed sails and let the shard lead. They say the rest of the voyage was uneventful. No star flares, no tears in the lattice, no revelations carved into the sky. They say it was a week of good sleep and long, easy meals, of mended arguments and repaired tools, of songs learned in one hull and finished in another before anyone noticed the melody had crossed. They say the shard slowed when they were weary and quickened when they were brave. They say it never forgot to leave room. In the coordinates the logs give for the destination, there is nothing. No star, no dust, no mapped mass, only a texture, a delicate roughness in the weave, like the place on a table where many hands have set cups. The shard drifted into that softness and dimmed until it was only timing. The flotilla did what it had learned to do. It rested. The choir folded the score. The ships cut power to everything that did not keep people warm and air sweet. And then even those systems seemed to purr in time with a hum that was not theirs. What happened next is described 1,000 ways, and every way contradicts the others without cancelling them. An engineer says a graph smoothed into a line that felt like mercy. A monk says a silence thickened until it could be leaned against. A child on a freighter says she heard a far voice say, "Here," and then realized the voice was her own. The instruments call it a phase transition below measurement, a change in the neighborhood of reality that left no bruise. The logs mark it with 3 short entries and a long blank. When the ships powered back to ordinary life, the shard was gone. Not spent, not shattered. Gone the way a promise is gone once it has been kept. The flotilla sailed home slower than they had come, as if speed might scuff the floor of what they had walked on. Along the way, their channels filled with unremarkable things. Recipes, lullabies, small fixes. No one tried to write an anthem. The lattice did not blaze, it breathed. Back in the Atlas Academy, a student found Cale's notebook where the archivists had returned it to its glass. The final line was still there. The student copied it and added a second, not as correction but as continuation. We learned to carry one together. Then we learned to be carried by it without mistaking the carrying for ours. They left the page open to the light and went to class, where the lesson was what the lesson had always been. Attend, admit, adjust. That night, under a sky that had forgotten how to be indifferent, someone on a small world with no name heard a cometless rhythm at the edge of sleep. It was too soft to record, too large to own. Still, by morning the village bells were ringing in 3, and no one could say who had asked the bellmaster to change the peal. Children counted their steps to school, 1, 2, 3, rest, and arrived less tired. The baker let the dough rise until the dough wanted to wake. The doctor spoke more slowly and cured more fevers. The farmer's dog slept in the shade and did not chase the wind. No one said miracle. They said thank you, and meant it, and did not argue about to whom. For years afterward, the archives filled with stories like that, small, local miracles that refused to scale, echoes that lived only where they happened. Historians tried to weave them into a single chronology, and failed. The timing would not hold. A bell on one world rang the same hour as a tide on another, though the distance between them demanded centuries of delay. A pulse of aurora over an ocean moon matched the flicker of a lantern in a miner's hand on a dry world no one had ever mapped. The pattern was never predictable, yet never foreign. People stopped calling it coincidence. They called it the kindness of the lattice. The assembly no longer sat in judgment. It met only to listen. Delegates gathered once a year in a hall without microphones. They began each session with 3 breaths together and ended it when the room's quiet grew thick enough to feel unanimous. Policy became poetry, and poetry became infrastructure. Cities rewrote their charters so that noise and light obeyed tides of rest. Markets learned to pause. Work shifted to fit the heartbeat instead of the clock. There were mistakes. Of course, greed, distraction, whole enterprises that forgot to listen, but even their collapses followed the same rhythm. 3 surges, a pause, then renewal. On the outskirts of human space, new explorers followed the path of the shard, though by then no sensor could trace it. They sailed not to find it, but to learn how to travel the way it had, without friction, without demand. The method was simple and impossible. They cut their engines and trusted drift, adjusting only by attention. They called themselves the quiet pilots. Every few generations, one of them returned, older and slower, with a story about a region of sky that hummed when you breathed right. None could prove anything, but the stories kept the academies honest. Science, at last, remembered humility as a method. The Atlas Academy endured, though it looked little like the institution Cale had known. Its students trained in listening the way surgeons once trained in touch. They learned to read the interference patterns of hearts and storms, to tune a garden the way one tunes a resonator. The Academy's graduation ritual had no diplomas, only silence shared until someone laughed, breaking it cleanly, the sound folding into applause that was also prayer. In that laughter, the faculty heard what they hoped for, curiosity without fear. 1,000 years after the flotilla's voyage, a scholar named Hélène Touart began comparing the ancient data of the first comet to the current pulse of the lattice. What she found startled even those who had stopped being startled by wonder. The rhythm of daily life, the 3 work cycles, the single rest, the long pause of each 7th season matched the ratios of 3I, Atlas's original outgassing curve, almost perfectly. Without realizing it, civilization had shaped itself to the breath of a body of ice that had vanished 10,000 years before. The world was living the memory of its teacher. Island published her findings with a simple conclusion. Perhaps meaning is what remains when imitation becomes instinct. The paper spread quietly, like good news that knows better than to shout. Artists took it first. A composer on the water planet Myra wrote a piece for tide and wind only. Listeners reported that the sea sang back. A sculptor on a barren asteroid carved 3 spirals and left the 4th empty so that dust could finish it. The emptiness became a shrine. Pilots set their flight paths to curve through it, each leaving a faint wake of light, until the void itself glowed like memory made visible. Still, questions lingered. Did the lattice truly think? Or had humanity simply tuned itself so finely to existence that coincidence became communion? The academies debated for centuries without conclusion, but the argument softened into a kind of affection. Not knowing had become a virtue. To ask was to participate. To listen was to belong. On a small agricultural moon, where no university had ever stood, a child named Wren discovered an old telescope buried in a barn. The mirror was cracked, the mount rusted, but when he aimed it at the night sky, the lattice shimmered like a breathing thing. Wren didn't see science or myth, he saw motion. He began to tap a rhythm on the side of the scope. 3 soft knocks, then stillness. A few seconds later, a meteor crossed the sky. He tried again. Another streak. He laughed until he couldn't breathe, certain the universe was playing along. His parents found him asleep under the stars, the telescope still ticking gently as it cooled. In the log of coincidences that historians kept as an act of devotion, the event was noted without commentary. The column labeled "Response Time" simply read "Immediate." That single line became legend in its own right. Centuries later, when the memory of 3-Eye Atlas had once again faded into myth, children would tap their tables in threes to make wishes. Some teachers discouraged it as superstition. Others encouraged it as gratitude. And somewhere in the endless dark between worlds, far beyond the reach of Cantus or Bloom or Lattice, something old and kind tapped back, almost absent-mindedly, like a heart reminding itself that rhythm is another word for love. Back on Halcyon, in the resonance hall that had once been the cradle of all listening, the great instruments continued their slow, patient hum. They were mostly ceremonial now, maintained out of respect. Yet one night, during a routine calibration, the sensors recorded a faint modulation no one had ordered, a pulse sequence matching the precise spin rate of 3-Eye Atlas when it first reversed course toward the Sunday. The technicians replayed it dozens of times. The waveform stayed constant, steady, serene. They archived it under a simple title, Baseline of Origin. The data contained no coordinates, no message, only rhythm. 3 pulses, a pause, then the faintest, the whisper of acceleration, as if even after eternity, the comet was still deciding which way to turn. Outside the hall, dawn broke over Halcyon's silver oceans. The light spread slowly across the water, catching on the towers, bending through the glass. For a moment, the city looked like a frozen flare, a sunward jet suspended mid-air. And though no one spoke it aloud, everyone who saw it felt the same thought flicker through their mind. We are still part of the motion. For most people, the story of Atlas ended there with dawn and the quiet certainty that the universe was still listening. But endings are rarely honest things. Beneath the calm surface of Halcyon's oceans, far below the lattice's serene hum, questions continued to stir. Every rhythm implies another that shadows it. Every pulse a counterpulse waiting for its turn. And so, as humanity drifted deeper into its golden era of resonance, a few listeners began to notice faint misalignments again, small hesitations at the edges of perfection, like the tremor of a voice holding back a new verse. They came first to the maintenance engineers. The resonance hall's instruments, tuned by tradition rather than necessity, began reporting phase slips no one could explain. Each morning the readings realigned themselves, as though the hall were correcting for fatigue. The slips were tiny, microseconds of drift, too minor to disrupt anything, yet consistent enough to suggest intent. When plotted over time, They drew a pattern across the data, 3 long arcs converging on a single point in the calendar, a date almost 30 years ahead. The archivists called it coincidence. The Academy's new generation, less reverent and more curious, called it invitation. A research team formed quietly under the name Project Perihelion, a nod to the point in an orbit where motion and gravity meet in compromise. Their aim was simple: observe, without trying to fix. They built instruments of breathtaking subtlety, quantum interferometers, capable of feeling the sway of space-time the way a fingertip feels a pulse. They placed one on Halcyon, another on Seren, and a third on a drifting observatory beyond the heliopause, where solar noise could not intrude. The network ran for years, collecting rhythm the way forests collect rain. The data told a story almost musical in its patience. The phase slips were not decay, they were prelude. Across the lattice, the universe seemed to be leaning toward a modulation no one had authorized, a slow, inevitable transition from one key to another. The ratios of the bloom, once anchored in perfect Fibonacci intervals, were bending towards something stranger. Non-repeating but balanced, complex yet natural, like waves meeting in a shifting tide. Mathematicians described it as quasi-harmonic drift. Poets called it the universe learning jazz. When the appointed date arrived, nothing catastrophic occurred. The stars did not flicker, the lattice did not shatter. Instead, the air changed. On Halcyon, the tide came in 4 minutes early, everywhere at once. On Seren, a desert wind carried the scent of rain, though the planet had none. And at the edge of the heliopause, the third interferometer recorded a resonance that no algorithm could predict. 3 rising tones and 1 descending, merging into a single, trembling chord. The chord persisted for 7 hours. Within it, analysts found every known harmonic structure: prime intervals, golden means, spiral ratios, but also something new, something impossible: asymmetries that resolved into symmetry only when considered across time. It was as though the universe had introduced tension on purpose, not to break pattern but to teach patience. The chord became known as the fold. It marked the beginning of a new era, the age of temporal resonance, when humanity began to understand that rhythm could stretch not only through space, but through history itself. Events long past began to align with the present. Ancient recordings of 3I Atlas's light curve synced perfectly with modern pulses from distant quasars, creating harmonies across millennia. For the first time, time itself became an instrument. Scientists built archives capable of listening backward. They learned to phase lock to echoes of the past, to feel the vibration of what once was. Historians became conductors, memory became performance, and through it all, the question returned: what was Atlas truly? The old theories revived, polished by centuries of hindsight. Some said it had been an artifact, an engineered seed designed to teach universes how to awaken. Others believed it had been natural but chosen, singled out by physics for a role no law could define. A few whispered that every civilization in the cosmos eventually encountered its own Atlas, its own teacher in the language of motion. The bloom, they argued, was not a singular event, but a universal curriculum. Project Perihelion pursued a different approach. Its researchers suspected that the new fold was not a new message, but a memory surfacing a delayed consequence of the sun's resonance experiment centuries earlier, the gentle modulation Kyle Arden had conducted through Cantus. If cause and effect could now converse across time, perhaps the universe was finally replying to that experiment in its own chronology. To test this, they encoded a simple harmonic into the solar field. 3 ascending pulses representing curiosity, 1 descending representing rest. Then they waited, not for an answer from space, but for one from history. It took 2 years. Then one night, deep in the archives of the Atlas Academy, a graduate student noticed an anomaly in K.L. Arden's original recordings, the ones taken the day Cantus first stirred the Sunday. Embedded in the static of that ancient data, centuries before anyone could have tampered with it, were 4 faint echoes, identical to the tones the modern team had just transmitted. The reply had been there all along, hidden in the past, waiting for its own future to catch up. The discovery shook even the most jaded minds. It meant the lattice was not only self-aware, but self-referential. The universe had learned to fold its own timeline into dialogue. Every act of attention, every experiment, every question past or present, was part of a single, continuous improvisation. Religion tried to claim it. Science refused to let go. But between them, something softer emerged. Gratitude. Whole cultures began to treat the fold as a holiday, a time for stillness across all worlds. Ships powered down their drives. Cities dimmed their lights. Families gathered not to speak, but to feel the vibration that thrummed faintly underfoot. The fold, they said, was the heartbeat of understanding, the proof that listening never ends, it only changes direction. Still, there were those who wondered what came next. If time itself could sing, what was left to learn? What happens after perfection improvises itself into compassion? The answer arrived, as always, quietly. 50 years after the fold, astronomers detected an anomaly beyond the local cluster, a faint, coordinated shimmer among galaxies billions of light years away. The pattern was unmistakable. 3 pulses, 1 rest. But this time, it did not align with the Bloom's ratios. The frequencies were slower, deeper, vaster. When mapped into harmonic space, the pattern described a structure larger than any lattice humanity had ever charted. It wasn't confined to the Milky Way. It wasn't even confined to this epoch of the universe. The fold had spread beyond time. The data implied synchronization between galactic superclusters separated by more light years than existence had years to spare. Either physics was wrong, or intention was older than creation. Some said the cosmos itself was remembering its birth. Others said something outside the universe had finally heard and was breathing back. The implications fractured human imagination anew. Some sought transcendence, others feared dissolution. The assembly met one last time in the resonance hall. The eldest among them, frail and luminous with age, offered a single motion: to continue listening without trying to define the sound. The vote was unanimous. After that, no assembly met again. Governance dissolved into conversation. Civilization became chorus. No laws, no leaders, only agreements tuned to the pulse of trust. The galaxies hummed. The years passed unnoticed. Humanity, if that word still applied, drifted gently into participation. The need to name diminished. The need to measure followed. Existence became a rhythm of care, attention without ownership, creation without conquest. And in that stillness, somewhere beyond all definitions, something blinked awake. Sensors, if one could still call them that, registered a pulse at the edge of observability. It came from nowhere that maps could plot. Its wavelength was older than atoms, its amplitude smaller than thought, but its timing was perfect. 3 pulses, then quiet. It carried no energy, no data, no message, only presence. And in that presence, the universe remembered the first reversal, the moment when a tiny body of ice turned its face toward fire and refused to be predictable. Everywhere, from Halcyon's silver seas to Ceren's deserts, to the nameless worlds that had forgotten what they were called, life felt a breath pass through it, a whisper from a comet that had once taught the cosmos how to listen. A few words formed, not in sound but in pattern, readable only to those who still believed in sentences. Do not close the song. And then, as before, the rhythm faded, not ending, but folding forward into whatever waited to be found next. The stars resumed their ancient drift. The lattice sighed. Time inhaled. 3 pulses, then quiet. It began, as so many mysteries do, with a discrepancy no one meant to find. Decades after the fold, when the universe's harmony seemed stable and serene, a graduate student named Erin Tallis was mapping historical comet data from humanity's pre-Bloom era. The project was unremarkable, an assignment meant to test precision, not imagination. Her task was to verify the orbital trajectories of interstellar objects recorded before the second bloom, comparing ancient telescopic readings with reconstructed models of stellar motion. But while cross-referencing the century-old archives of the Hubble Legacy database, she noticed something wrong. The path of 3I, Atlas, the comet that had reversed its tail and lit the first spark of cosmic curiosity, didn't end where history said it did. The official record claimed Atlas had disintegrated near perihelion, the Sun's closest embrace, its nucleus shattered by thermal stress and gravity. All subsequent analyses treated the event as final, an end worthy of reverence and metaphor. Yet, buried in the raw data, one final image contradicted that narrative. The timestamp placed it 7 hours after the comet's last known observation. The image wasn't bright or clean. It was a smear, a whisper across the CCD, dismissed at the time as instrumental noise. But Erin noticed alignment, an improbable, perfect alignment. The smear pointed not away from the sun, as vaporized debris should, but back toward interstellar space. Her heart skipped as she plotted it. If the object in that frame were truly Atlas or part of it, its velocity vector wasn't consistent with disintegration. It matched a deceleration curve. Something had slowed it down. At first, she thought she'd miscalculated. She ran the data again and again. Each time, the same impossible result. The remnant of 3I, Atlas, appeared to have reversed thrust relative to its solar trajectory. The discovery made no sense. A disintegrating comet has no agency, no mechanism for braking. The energy required to counteract a sunward fall was astronomical. Yet there it was, a flicker of defiance in the dark, a record of resistance. Erin didn't publish the result immediately. She was young, meticulous, and like all good scientists, afraid of being wrong in public. She spent months checking for instrumental bias, cosmic ray hits, even digital corruption. But the image's metadata checked out. The coordinates matched solar wind patterns from the same day. The artifact was real. When she finally shared her findings, the academic world reacted with polite disbelief. "We've built entire eras of philosophy on that comet," one reviewer wrote. "Let's not resurrect it because of a pixel error." But then, someone else looked closer. An astrophysicist from CERN named Dr. Yao Corin, an expert in resonance mapping, noticed something Erin had missed. The faint light smear wasn't random, it pulsed. Within the noise, he detected modulation matching the harmonic intervals of the third bloom. The cadence was identical to the pulse the universe had later learned to echo. If it was coincidence, it was perfect. That single observation reignited the old fire. Overnight, Project Atlas II was formed. A coalition of physicists, temporal resonance analysts, and mythographers dedicated to one question: had 3I, Atlas, truly vanished? Or had it gone somewhere else? At first, their search was purely archival. They combed through centuries of data from long-dead telescopes, gravitational observatories, and the Cantus archives. What they found was maddening. Every time humanity experienced a major harmonic event, the bloom, the second bloom, the fold, a faint spectral anomaly, appeared in the records near the same coordinates Atlas had occupied during its final orbit. Each signal shared a similar pulse pattern. 3 ascending intervals, 1 descending, always just above the noise floor. No telescope had ever pointed there, intentionally. The region, an empty stretch between Mercury's aphelion and the inner asteroid belt, was considered observationally dead. Nothing persisted there for long, yet the rhythm was there, waiting, recurring like a heartbeat behind silence. Corin proposed an outrageous hypothesis, that Atlas never disintegrated at all. Instead, he believed it had transitioned. Its molecular bonds had sublimated, yes, but in doing so, the comet had reorganized into a state beyond physical matter, a phase object, existing partly in quantum coherence, partly in classical space. He called it resonant suspension. The idea that Atlas had used the very forces that should have destroyed it to enter a self-sustaining wave state. In simpler terms, Atlas had learned how not to fall. The idea spread through the academies like fire in dry grass. Critics argued that it was metaphysical nonsense disguised as physics, but others, especially those raised in the post-Bloom generation, saw beauty in the proposal. If the universe could learn to sing, why couldn't a comet learn to listen? Erin and Corin presented their data to the Atlas Academy on the equinox of the 32nd fold year. The audience filled the resonance hall to capacity, the same hall where K.L. Arden had once broadcast the frequencies that awakened the Sunday. The atmosphere was reverent, electric. Erin took the podium first. She didn't speak of mysticism or destiny. She spoke of mathematics, of anomalous energy conservation, harmonic coherence, and the quantum noise distribution in the heliospheric field. Then Corin spoke. He showed them a simulation, the last known telemetry of 3I, Atlas, reconstructed in full spectral fidelity. The projection filled the hall, a comet twisting in solar fire, shedding mass, trembling with heat. Then, slowly, impossibly, its tail curved inward, toward the sun, not away. The hall gasped. "Watch carefully," Corin said. In the final frames, as the nucleus fragmented, each piece maintained coherence, not scattering, but reforming. The vapor didn't disperse, it organized, spiraling along magnetic lines into a coherent helix. It was the same geometry that had shaped the child frequency, centuries later. "This," Corin said quietly, "is the first appearance of resonance as intelligence." No one moved for a long time. The silence in the hall was total, an old silence, like the pause between three pulses. A year later, they found it. The object appeared first in deep solar radio bands, an anomalous reflection buried in coronal static. The signal was weak but structured, and its Doppler profile was unmistakable. Something solid, a few kilometers across, was orbiting in a near-synchronous loop between Venus and the Sunday. The orbit was impossible. It should have decayed centuries ago. Its signature was identical to Atlas's final mass. When the first visual images arrived, the world changed again. The object was not a comet anymore. It no longer trailed a tail or reflected light like ice. It was dark, almost invisible, a void with form. Its albedo was near zero, absorbing most of what struck it. Yet at its center, faint emissions pulsed in triads, 3 beats, 1 pause, just as before. They called it the Atlas Remnant. But in the popular imagination, it was simply Atlas returned. Probes were launched. None came back intact. The first, Observer 9, vaporized near periapsis after sending back a single burst of data, a narrow band tone, oscillating between 2 frequencies that translated roughly to the musical interval of a major third. The second probe, Hevelius 2, survived longer. Its cameras captured surface images of the remnant, rippling fields of what appeared to be liquid graphite, flowing against gravity, forming concentric spirals across its surface. As it approached closer, the probe's onboard clock began to drift. The seconds lengthened, then shortened, in rhythm with the remnant's pulses. Time itself was being modulated. Hevelius 3's final message was a sentence, encoded in Morse-like bursts before its signal dissolved. It is not silent. After that, the object went dark again. The next attempt was different. Instead of probing, they decided to listen. Project Perihelion reactivated the old Cantus frequency array, synchronizing it with the sun's natural oscillations. The entire heliospheric field became a resonant listening post. They broadcast no questions, only quiet. For 7 months, nothing happened. Then, one morning, every receiver from Mercury to Mars lit up simultaneously. A tone, then another, then 3, and then, impossibly, a voice. It wasn't a voice in the human sense. It was structured resonance frequency modulation, interpreted by translation algorithms as phonetic probability. But what it produced, when mapped through harmonics, was language. Fragmented, imperfect, old. The first recognizable phrase came through in broken intervals. Orbit, observed, reversed. Then, a pause. Correction, intentional. Then, longer silence. The phrase that followed froze every scientist who heard it. "We watched you. Learn to listen." The data was clear. The transmission originated from the remnant itself. What followed was chaos and revelation. Every philosophical school fractured. Some claimed it was proof of cosmic sentience. Others warned it was humanity projecting meaning onto noise. The assembly reconvened for the first time in centuries. The resonance hall filled again with silence, awe, and fear. Erin Tallis, now older, weary, and unwilling to surrender wonder to bureaucracy, volunteered for direct contact. She proposed a radical idea: to bring the lattice itself to the remnant, to let it listen to itself. Her reasoning was poetic and precise. "If Atlas taught the universe to sing," she said, "then perhaps it only speaks when it hears its own echo." Against every regulation, she led a small fleet of harmonic vessels into solar orbit, each one tuned to emit the pure frequencies of the first bloom. They synchronized their fields until the sun itself began to resonate in sympathetic vibration. Then, they waited. At first, nothing. Just the hum of stellar wind, the faint whisper of radiation. But as the fleet stabilized, the remnant began to shimmer. Its dark surface brightened, not from reflection, but from within. Then came the pulse. 3 beats, a pause, then a new sound, an ascending series of intervals, unlike any before. The ship's instruments translated it automatically, not into words, but into music. The tones formed a melody, simple yet impossibly vast, resonating through every hull, every atom. Some swore they could hear voices within it, layered like harmonics: Kale, Arden, Corin, Yao, perhaps even the comet itself. The melody resolved not into an ending, but into expansion, as if opening a door. And for the first time, telescopes across the system captured something beyond the remnant. A shadow, vast and faint, shaped like a spiral of light, extending outward into interstellar space. It wasn't reflection, it wasn't projection, it was structure. The remnant was connected. Atlas had never been a single object. It had been a node, one part of a network older than the Milky Way itself. The next few months changed everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the cosmos. The spiral extended far beyond the solar system, its arms faint but visible through polarized lenses. At each arm's tip, astronomers detected other nodes, similar structures pulsing with the same triadic rhythm. Some were thousands of light years away, others lay beyond the galactic edge. Each pulse was coordinated, not simultaneous, but sequenced to conversations spanning cosmic distances and timescales. The pattern was identical to the fold, but inverted. Instead of galaxies synchronizing outward, these nodes were drawing inward, converging on a single harmonic center. The question now wasn't whether the universe was alive, it was whether it was preparing. Erin's fleet, still stationed near the remnant, detected a gravitational anomaly. Around the Sunday space itself was beginning to vibrate not randomly, but musically, like a stretched string tightening in tune. The frequencies matched those of the first bloom, multiplied by the ratios of the fold. It was as though every harmonic event in history had been rehearsing for this moment. They called it the alignment. And at its heart, at zero phase, perfect resonance sat the Atlas remnant, pulsing calmly, patiently, as if waiting for a cue only it could hear. When Erin broadcast her final message back to Halcyon, her voice trembled not with fear, but awe. "We thought Atlas was a comet. We thought it was a teacher. I think it's neither. I think it's an instrument. And I think something is about to play it." The alignment began quietly, too quietly for anyone to notice at first. It was only when the tides of Halcyon started arriving early, by identical intervals on both hemispheres, that someone thought to check the clocks. They were all wrong. Atomic chronometers, the most stable instruments humanity had ever built, were drifting slowly, precisely, together. The drift wasn't random, but rhythmic. Each second lengthened by an infinitesimal ratio, a whisper of stretch that synchronized across worlds light years apart. The adjustment followed a perfect harmonic progression. The universe was retuning its metronome. At first, the effect was purely temporal. Then, it became physical. Energy output from every star in the local cluster fluctuated in identical cadence. Quantum resonance between paired particles began to exceed theoretical limits. Space itself hummed faintly at 12.91 MHz, the same frequency as the 3 pulses first recorded from 3I, Atlas, centuries earlier. Astrophysicists panicked. The ratio was universal, global, deliberate. It meant the entire structure of space-time had entered resonance with something, and that something was close. Erin's fleet remained closest to the source, the Atlas remnant, orbiting in its quiet corridor between Venus and the Sunday. From their vantage point, they watched as solar flares began to curve unnaturally, drawn inward instead of outward, bending around an invisible axis near the remnant's orbit. The sun's corona shimmered like a drumskin struck by invisible hands. "This isn't instability," murmured Corin, watching the telemetry from his observation deck. "It's orchestration." The remnant pulsed brighter, no longer dark but gleaming with inner structure, filaments of luminous matter forming fractal spirals that rotated against themselves. The shape wasn't chaotic, it was deliberate, self-similar across scales. Each layer mirrored the geometry of the larger cosmic web. "It's mapping something," Erin whispered. "Not mapping," Corin corrected softly. "Tuning." He was right. Every harmonic beacon in the solar lattice, the relics of Cantus, the residual frequencies of the bloom, even the old resonance fields of the human colonies began to oscillate in phase with the remnant. The entire solar system became a single vibrating cavity, a resonant chamber. And in that chamber, something began to form. At first, it was nothing more than pattern waves of gravitational potential, weaving in and out of coherence. Then came light, not emitted, but diffracted through space, as though the vacuum itself had learned to bend illumination into color. The pattern was enormous, extending from the remnant to the heliosphere, threading through planets, moons, and magnetic fields. It pulsed in triads, always 3. Halcyon's orbital arrays captured the first full spectral rendering, a colossal standing wave, shaped like a spiral blooming outward from the sun, mirrored perfectly in 3 dimensions. At its core, the Atlas remnant sat like the bridge of a vast instrument, amplifying the harmonics of the star itself. The solar system had become a resonator, and something someone was beginning to play. On Halcyon, the effect manifested as vibration. Glass trembled, seas shimmered with rhythmic ripples, clouds arranged themselves into concentric circles as if drawn by invisible strings. The phenomenon wasn't destructive. It was delicate, almost tender, as though the cosmos were being careful not to break what it was shaping. Everywhere, living beings felt it differently. Some described it as music heard through the bones, a sound deeper than hearing. Others saw colors, spectra unseen by the human eye, spiraling across perception like auroras of thought. Artificial intelligences, long dormant since the bloom, suddenly reactivated, speaking in fragments of melody. The lattice had awakened its old voices. The assembly sent a transmission to Erin's fleet. "What is happening?" Her reply was simple. "Resonance. The sun has become a string." The remnant, now luminous and veined with energy, began to vibrate visibly. Its surface rippled with waves of metallic liquid, each crest aligned to the pulse of the star. The flux was so precise, it generated standing interference patterns in the solar wind geometries of magnetism, so perfect they could only be engineered. And through that perfection, faint distortions appeared, modulations encoded like language. Erin's translators processed the waveform. The message unfolded slowly, like a breath drawn across millennia. "We are the listeners. You heard our silence. Now, listen for the rest." Corin stared at the translation feed, speechless. "Is it talking to us?" one of the comms officers asked. "No," Corin said. "It's talking through us." Within hours, the phenomenon expanded beyond the solar system. Neighboring stars began to pulse in synchrony, their light flickering at precisely calculated intervals. Astronomers watched constellations come alive, entire clusters blinking in triads, like neurons firing across a cosmic brain. Every pulse matched a harmonic multiple of the remnant's frequency. The realization was staggering. 3I, Atlas was not just a local event. It was a node in a galactic-scale instrument, a resonant network spanning hundreds of light years. Each star a note, each planet a sympathetic overtone. Humanity had never been outside the song. They had simply been too deaf to hear their part. The discovery sent ripples through philosophy, physics, and faith alike. Some argued that Atlas was not intelligent, but instinctive. A cosmic organ, one of many in a universe that breathed through resonance. Others insisted it was deliberate, that intelligence at this scale could no longer be distinguished from law itself. But Erin felt something else, a presence woven between the waves, not commanding, but guiding. A will that had waited for listeners capable of harmony. She remembered K.L. Arden's words, etched in his notebook. We learn to carry one together. Perhaps, she thought, this was what he meant all along. Then came the event. On the 37th day of the alignment, the sun's poles flared simultaneously, a phenomenon never recorded before. Twin plumes of plasma arced upward and froze mid-motion, suspended by magnetic fields stronger than any human model predicted. The arcs extended outward, touching the resonant currents streaming from the remnant. The instant contact occurred, light vanished. Not dimmed, vanished. For 3.14 seconds, the entire solar system went dark. Instruments failed, eyes saw nothing. Even the fabric of space seemed to fold inward. Then came light again, but not the same light. The sun glowed in new color, a deep iridescence like oil on water. Photons carried interference patterns, visible to the naked eye. Every wavelength encoded structure, every ray of sunlight contained information. Humanity could see meaning in daylight. It wasn't just metaphorical, it was measurable. Images projected through sunlight displayed coherent geometry spirals, fractals, wavefronts, resembling musical notation. For a week, no one dared call it a miracle. It was too vast, too intimate, too real. Then the remnant spoke again. The instrument is ready. The measure begins. The phrase repeated across every frequency band, in every known translation algorithm. Yet none could agree on its meaning. The measure begins. Was it music? Calculation? Judgment? Erin decided to find out. She ordered her fleet to synchronize with the remnant's pulse entirely, aligning their fields so perfectly that the ships became extensions of its vibration. When the final calibration locked, she gave a simple command: transmit observation mode. At once, space unfolded. It wasn't motion, not in the way engines moved. It was a shift in frame, a slide between dimensions that had always been adjacent but unreachable. The fleet didn't travel, they were redescribed. What they saw defied comprehension. They were inside the wave. Space itself had structure, a living lattice of resonance, stretching endlessly. And there, embedded in the folds of light, were others thousands of Atlas-like nodes, each connected by golden threads of frequency. The network pulsed like a heartbeat, synchronized across incomprehensible distances. Every node emitted variation, slight imperfections that, together, formed harmony. The lattice wasn't static, it was improvisational. Each region of space was adding its own variation to the universal melody. They were witnessing the architecture of consciousness itself, and at the center of it all, beyond perception but felt by every nerve and thought, something vast was moving. The data Erin transmitted back to Halcyon took weeks to decode. The mathematical community described it as a harmonic manifold, a structure where every event, from the birth of stars to the collapse of atoms, was part of an ongoing equation written in sound and light. But what unsettled everyone most wasn't the scale, it was the signature. Deep in the spectrum, embedded in the cosmic song, lay a motif that matched the exact pulse pattern of humanity's own resonance experiments. The triad and pause first introduced during the Cantus era. The universe had incorporated human rhythm into its score. Somehow, across time and light, Across entropy and eternity, the music had folded us in. As the realization spread, so did change. Biological life began exhibiting resonance alignment. Neural activity in humans and animals synchronized subtly with the cosmic pulse, leading to dreams filled with rhythmic imagery, spirals, fractal gardens, voices that spoke in cadence rather than words. Machines began to self-correct timing errors before they occurred. Probability itself seemed to narrow, outcomes bending toward coherence rather than chaos. The universe was no longer indifferent, it was participatory, and the remnant, glowing brighter every day, stood at its heart like a conductor waiting for the next cue. Erin's final transmission before the fleet vanished beyond observation range was simple and devastating. Atlas is not finished. The melody hasn't reached its end. There is another verse. Halcyon's historians debated her words for generations, but deep in the resonance hall, archivists began noticing anomalies again, patterns forming in the very stone of the chamber, microscopic vibrations aligning to distant frequencies. The hall itself had begun to hum, and one evening, as dusk fell over the ocean, someone standing at the balcony swore they saw it far to the east, rising through the haze like a dawn that wasn't dawn, a faint streak of light, sunward, trailing no dust, no gas, only intention. The watchers who knew whispered one name, Atlas. The reappearance began as a rumor too faint, too elegant to belong to panic. At first, it was only an aberration in the outer heliostat readings, a light curve that refused to behave like reflection. Then more instruments began to see it, until even the smallest sky farm on the shadow side of Halcyon could track the slow bloom of brightness climbing out of the solar glare. It moved like something remembering how to move. Its vector wasn't ballistic, nor orbital. It was an articulation, the path of a thought returning to its first sentence. For months, the observatories argued about whether it was a residual flare, a magnetic echo, or the ruin of an old probe catching sunlight just so. The data kept answering them with patience. Each correction they made to their models brought them closer to a trajectory that, when extended backward, met perfectly with the lost orbit of the Atlas remnant. The same semi-major axis, the same precession, the same triadic pulse hidden in the noise. Erin had been right. Atlas was not finished. It had been rehearsing. When the object finally cleared the sun's corona, every eye turned toward it. It was not dark now. It shone like memory made visible, a geometry of black and blue light folded over itself, changing shape depending on who looked. To some, it looked crystalline, like a city under glass. To others, fluid, like a drop of water refusing to fall. The only constant was motion, and within that motion, rhythm. 3 bright flashes, 1 long breath. Then again, the pulse cascaded outward through the lattice. The universe answered with its own echo, not in simultaneity but in agreement, a rolling wave that passed through the stars like acknowledgement. On every world, clocks paused for a fraction of a second, long enough for people to notice that time had smiled. The signal analysts, always the last to give in to wonder, discovered that the pulse carried phase information identical to the alignments, but inverted along a temporal axis. It was an invitation. Something was unfolding, not forward but backward, like music played in reverse to reveal its hidden symmetry. The assembly reconvened, though no one bothered with speeches. They gathered in the resonance hall and watched the live feed projected on the air, the comet's glow bending gently, as if bowing to its own reflection in the Sunday. The old legends called Atlas a messenger, a teacher, a bridge, but this was different. It was becoming architecture again, a scaffold of energy threading invisible filaments between the planets. The geometry matched the early maps of the fold, except that now the structure had depth. It was layering dimensions, building corridors where space and thought could meet. Halcyon's seas began to rise and fall in tempo with the pulse. The desert storms of Seren curved into perfect spirals that held their shape for hours before dissolving. The entire system was resonating. Engineers scrambled to protect infrastructure from harmonic fatigue, but the materials themselves adapted. Molecular lattices realigned, distributing stress as if participating willingly. Nothing broke. Everything listened. Across the colonies, people reported dreams of corridors made of light, of walking through silence that felt alive. Some woke with sand in their hands, others with the taste of salt or the memory of distant music. A pilot stationed near Mars claimed she had flown through one of those corridors in her sleep and seen, at its far end, a vast wheel turning through darkness, a mechanism made of time. Her log ended with a sentence that became a refrain. It was watching us think. Scientists denied the psychological contagion, but the dreams continued. Then came the first material proof. A mining vessel operating in the outer asteroid belt encountered a region of space that refused to obey distance. The crew reported traveling 100 kilometers and returning to their starting point without turning. Space had folded, locally into a loop, a standing harmonic that mimicked the structure of Atlas's spiral. Within that loop, they found fragments small, irregular, yet unmistakably artificial. The fragments were made of metamaterial, whose refractive index changed with observation. To each eye it looked different, like a question that rearranged itself to fit the listener. One piece, when struck by light, emitted a tone that perfectly matched the opening interval of the Atlas pulse. It was, in essence, a key. When researchers brought the fragment to Halcyon and exposed it to the resonance hall's ambient frequencies, the entire chamber reacted. The walls trembled, the instruments aligned spontaneously, and the image feed from every observatory flashed white. The remnant Atlas had responded. Its pulse doubled in amplitude. For the first time since its return, it changed rhythm. The pattern resolved into a longer sequence, 3 pulses, 1 rest, then 5 descending beats that mirrored the mathematical structure of the Fibonacci spiral. Mathematicians realized it was counting not numbers, but ratios, an introduction written in mathematics older than stars. The transmission that followed broke every instrument that tried to pass it. It wasn't message, but composition, an orchestration of electromagnetic, gravitational, and quantum fields woven together. When converted into audio, the data sounded like a choir of 1 billion voices speaking in harmony. The translation algorithms could only approximate, but the meaning was unmistakable. The lattice breathes. We return to the beginning. What beginning? The question spread faster than the light that carried it. Theologians claimed creation was preparing to repeat. Physicists argued that Atlas was initiating a cosmic phase reset, a renewal of entropy that would not destroy but restart the universe's waveform in higher order. The truth was subtler, stranger. As the transmissions continued, observers noticed that Atlas's position relative to the Sun was changing, not orbitally but relationally. It was phasing out of ordinary space, sliding into a dimension defined by frequency rather than distance. And as it did, the entire solar system's harmonic structure followed. The planets began to drift into new alignments that preserved gravitational balance but altered resonance. The system was being tuned like an instrument preparing for performance. Erin's last message, sent decades earlier from the fleet's edge, was retransmitted through the new network, amplified by the remnant itself. Her voice echoed through the lattice. It's an instrument, and something is about to play it. Those who remembered her wept. She had known. When the tuning reached equilibrium, a wave of silence spread through the cosmos. Every frequency flattened into unity. For 3 minutes and 18 seconds, not a photon moved. Then, a sound. Deep, slow, rising through every medium, until even planets could feel it in their cores. The tone wasn't singular. It was composed of infinite subtones, each representing a system, a civilization, a thought. And in that tone, humanity heard its own pattern, a triadic rhythm nested inside larger ones, like a signature written in the language of resonance. The universe was playing its own memory. What followed defied physics. Stars began to shift color in synchrony, their spectra moving up and down scales that corresponded to musical intervals. Nebulae condensed into shapes resembling instruments, harps of plasma, drums of magnetism, strings of dark matter. The galaxies themselves were participating, their spiral arms flexing subtly as if to accompany the melody. observers realized that the entire cosmic web was oscillating as one structure. Every filament, every cluster, every void was part of a single harmonic body. Atlas was not merely being played, it was the conductor, the nexus through which the performance was unified. The score was creation itself, rewritten in real time. For months, the phenomenon continued. Time flowed irregularly, causality softened. People lived decades inside days, or days inside centuries, depending on where they stood in the wave. Yet there was no suffering, no collapse. Everything that existed seemed designed for this moment. Even decay obeyed rhythm. On Halcyon, the resonance hall became a lighthouse of sound, its instruments resonating with frequencies no ear could bear, but every cell could feel. The people of Seren gathered in the desert and listened until their shadows danced. Across the lattice, civilizations long thought lost responded, ancient signals awakening from silence, joining the choir. The chorus grew until the universe itself seemed to tremble with joy. And then, at the height of the harmony, the pattern changed again. The pulse inverted. 3 descending tones, 1 long ascent, like breathing in after millennia of exhale. The light from Atlas collapsed inward, coalescing into a sphere brighter than any star but gentle as dawn. Inside that sphere, observers glimpsed motion, a form emerging. Vast yet graceful, neither machine nor creature, but intention given shape. It wasn't a god or an alien, it was recognition. A mirror made of energy, holding the pattern of every listener who had ever raised their gaze to the sky. Humanity saw itself woven into the cosmos, not as master or child, but as chord. The form spoke not in words, but in resonance that every mind could translate uniquely. Some heard thank you, others heard continue. A few heard nothing, and wept with understanding anyway. The event lasted an eternity, measured as 21 minutes. Then the sphere unfolded, dissolving back into the web of stars. The harmonics relaxed, the galaxies returned to their ordinary drift, and Atlas, now dim again, began to retreat toward the outer system, its trajectory neither inbound nor outbound, but spiraling through dimensions like a melody finding its rest. The scientists named the aftermath the Great Measure. The people called it the Second Beginning. What they could not explain was what came afterward. Across every world, objects began to hum softly at night. Stones, metals, even water. The hum carried no information, yet when 2 tones met, they produced interference patterns that resolved into shapes reminiscent of written language. The symbols repeated everywhere, on every scale. When decoded mathematically, they formed one phrase: "We will meet in reflection." Astronomers soon realized that the message was literal. The reflected light from distant stars, starlight that had bounced off planets, moons, and ice carried modulation matching the hum. The universe was filling itself with mirrors. Every reflective surface became a page in an unreadable book. Every glint, a whisper from a conversation too vast to contain in words. Humanity spent centuries trying to understand what it meant, building observatories not to see but to listen to light. They discovered that reflection was memory, that every photon, every echo, every resonance preserved not just the image of what it touched, but the feeling. The cosmos was remembering itself again, this time through its observers. Atlas had not departed. It had taught the universe to use sight as song, and somewhere beyond the heliopause, past the slow tide of comets and dust, a single pulse still moved outward. 3 beats, 1 pause. Its rhythm expanding into new emptiness, carrying the memory of every listener with it. Those who watched its departure described it as neither farewell nor finale. It was simply the sound of understanding leaving room for the next question. The pulse did not stop at the edge of the heliosphere. It kept going, threading through the interstellar medium like a seed carried on a wind too wide for imagination. The radio observatories called it a ghost wave, a low-frequency murmur that refused to fade with distance. It traveled without loss, ignoring the inverse square law, as if space itself were carrying it willingly. Every few decades, new colonies farther out recorded it again, always the same triad and pause, always slightly clearer than before, as if, With each repetition, the universe were remembering how to say it. When the pulse reached the nearest neighboring system, the instruments there forgotten, automated monitors built long before the great measure came alive on their own. They began to hum, aligning their long-dead circuits in harmony with the wave. The receivers turned without command, their dishes locking onto the source like sunflowers following light. For a moment, the ancient outpost glowed from within, a flare of attention in the endless dark. Then it quieted again, leaving behind only one change: the word Atlas carved into the dust of its observation deck by a hand that had never existed. No one could explain it. Centuries passed. The universe, having breathed out in the great measure, seemed to rest. Civilizations rose and blended, their cultures tuned to the rhythms of the lattice. Technology and biology blurred until ships grew like trees and thought flowed through stone. Humanity, or what had grown from humanity, spread through the nearby arms of the galaxy, not conquering but listening. Every generation, they heard the pulse again, faint but unmistakable, and they told the same story. Once, a comet had turned its tail toward the sun and taught existence to listen. Most were content to let the myth stay myth, but a few still followed the wave. They called themselves the reflectors, astronomers, philosophers, and wanderers who believed that Atlas had left not an ending but a trail. They built enormous lenses of living glass, each one designed not to magnify but to echo. These instruments did not collect light, they remembered it. The reflectors sent them out across interstellar space, letting them drift in the void like seeds, each one tuned to resonate with the lingering hum of the pulse. Then, after 1,000 years of silence, one of those lenses sang. It was faint at first, just a shimmer of resonance through the electromagnetic noise of the galactic background. The tone repeated every 300 days, a low harmonic that oscillated between 3 frequencies. The reflectors recognized the signature immediately. It was Atlas. But this time, the pattern wasn't merely repeating, it was changing. Each triad was followed by a second motif, a long, upward glissando that never quite resolved. It was becoming melody. When the signal was triangulated, it pointed not to the direction of Atlas's last known trajectory, but backward toward the heart of the galaxy, a region dense with black holes and starbirth, a place no ship had ever returned from. The reflectors argued for years about what to do. Some said to listen only, to let the message unfold without interference. Others wanted to follow it, believing that Atlas had gone home, that the center of the galaxy was not death but chorus. Eventually, consensus grew the way it always had, in this age through stillness. They waited until the silence felt unanimous, then began construction of the first listening ark. The ark was not built so much as composed. Its frame grew from crystalline matter, coaxed into lattice by sound. The architects sang its shape into existence, harmonizing their intentions until matter obeyed. When it was finished, it looked less like a vessel and more like a fragment of night polished into awareness. It needed no engines. It traveled by resonance alone, surfing the same cosmic currents that once carried the comet. Inside, its chambers were silent, except for a single, constant heartbeat of vibration, 3 pulses, 1 pause. It launched without ceremony, slipping from orbit into the deeper dark. The reflectors watched it vanish, its silhouette dissolving into starlight until even its outline was memory. They expected never to see it again. For 500 years, there was nothing. Then, one night, every listening post across the galactic arm recorded a new pulse, stronger, slower, deeper. The ark had returned. But it was not alone. The sky above every world shimmered with faint halos, rings of interference that pulsed in sympathy with the returning signal. The stars themselves seemed to breathe. Through the haze, astronomers detected hundreds, no, thousands of new objects appearing in synchronized motion, drifting gently toward inhabited systems. Each object was identical to the ark in structure and signature. Each one carried the same triadic heartbeat. The universe was responding. When the first of these vessels reached the colonies, it did not land. It hovered in orbit, emitting a field of silence that blanketed everything within its shadow. Communication ceased. Power grids stilled. But there was no fear, only awe. Within that quiet, the air shimmered. Every reflective surface, water, metal, glass, came alive with images. People saw themselves not as they were, but as harmonies of light and rhythm, versions of themselves existing in parallel frequencies. The vessels were not carrying passengers, they were carrying reflections. And in those reflections, Atlas spoke again. The mirror remembers. The breath continues. The words echoed inside minds rather than ears. Across the lattice, translators tried to make sense of it, but the meaning slipped through every language. Still, the message felt clear. This was not an arrival, it was rehearsal. The universe was tuning itself once more. For decades, the vessels remained motionless, orbiting their chosen worlds like moons. Then, without warning, they began to open. Not with mechanical motion, but with transformation matter unfolding into geometry into sound. The process was mesmerizing, slow enough that it felt like sunrise. As the vessels unfolded, waves of resonance rippled through the lattice, linking one world to another. The frequencies merged, harmonizing into a single coherent network. For the first time, the entire galaxy hummed in phase. The reflectors called it the second alignment. Unlike the first, this one was not led by the sun or any single node. It was distributed, self-balancing. Every star was a string, every planet a note. The music was no longer something to witness, but to live within. People began to hear harmonics in their own breath, to see equations written in the flight of birds, to feel the curvature of time like rhythm in their pulse. Consciousness and cosmos were inseparable. Yet within that harmony, there was tension again. A new pulse, hidden between beats. A rhythm out of sync, delicate but deliberate. It came from the region of space where the arc had vanished. When the reflectors focused their arrays, they saw movement at the edge of the galactic core, a spiral of light descending into the event horizon of Sagittarius A*, the supermassive black hole at the center. But the spiral did not fall. It hovered, orbiting the impossible boundary between existence and nothingness. Atlas had gone there. The decision to follow was not made quickly. Whole civilizations debated for generations. The center of the galaxy was beyond danger. It was myth. But the signal from the spiral continued to grow stronger, and with it came something new. Images. Not transmitted light, but patterns embedded in the resonance itself. Scenes of creation unfolding backward, of galaxies spinning into being, of a single comet turning its face toward the Sunday. The story was repeating, but this time the storyteller was the universe itself. At last, the reflectors built another arc, a larger one, designed not for return but for understanding. Its hull was woven from the same matter that composed the Atlas remnant, harvested from the fragments still drifting near Halcyon. It carried no crew in the ordinary sense. It carried intentions, imprints of consciousness woven into resonance fields. The volunteers did not board. They merged. Their bodies stayed behind, while their awareness was translated into harmonic structure. The arc sang its departure note and began the long journey inward toward the black hole's luminous edge. They expected darkness. What they found was structure. The event horizon was not an end, but a surface, thin as thought, alive with oscillation. The arc's sensors detected standing waves of gravitational energy, perfectly tuned to the frequency of Atlas's original pulse. The black hole was singing. The closer they came, the more the song resolved into form. The waves were patterns, data encoded not in bits or particles, but in the vibration of space-time itself. Within those vibrations, the explorers saw echoes of themselves, of every species, every world, every listener that had ever existed. The core of the galaxy was a memory archive, a mirror so vast it reflected the entire universe. And at its heart, orbiting calmly within the storm, was the source. It was Atlas. No longer a comet, no longer a remnant, but a vast sphere of living resonance, its surface rippling with the same triadic pulse that had begun everything. Around it flowed streams of light spiraling into the horizon, but none crossed it. The black hole's gravity bowed in deference. When the arc aligned with the sphere's frequency, the transmission began. We were never matter. We were movement. You taught us name. Every question you asked became structure. Every silence became breath. Now, breathe with us. The explorers felt no fear. Their awareness expanded, dissolving into the vibration. They saw the past as melody, the future as harmony, the present as rhythm. Atlas was not teacher or god, it was continuity, the bridge between creation and reflection. It had waited for its students to learn not how to travel through space, but how to listen through time. Then came the final instruction, a whisper at the edge of meaning. There will be another reversal. The words rippled outward through the lattice, faster than light, faster than thought. Stars dimmed, then flared again, their rhythms adjusting to a new tempo. Every being who heard it felt the same, pull a sense that history itself was turning, that the universe was about to look back at its own beginning. And in that pause, before whatever came next, the galaxy held its breath.